Welcome, weary tarnished, to a journey through the ancient skies and forgotten realms where dragons once ruled supreme. Tonight, we venture beyond the lands between surface troubles, ascending to the storm-racked heights of Farum Azula and descending into the primordial depths where the first flames kindled draconic power. Here, in this space between waking and dreaming, we shall trace the lineage of stone-scaled ancients, witness the rise and fall of dragon lords, and explore the tragic bonds between mortals and the winged gods they both revered and consumed. Close your eyes when ready, and let the eternal storms carry you into peaceful rest. In the beginning, before the golden light of the Erdtree had ever touched the lands between, before the concepts of grace and guidance had taken root in mortal hearts, there existed an age that history would come to call prehistoric. This was not merely a time before kings and kingdoms, but an epoch that preceded the very notion of written record, a period so distant that its truths survived only in whispered legends and the testimony of stones themselves. This was the age of ancient dragons, when beings of stone and storm held dominion over a world that knew neither the rigid hierarchies of gods nor the desperate strugglings of men. In this primordial time, the very air hummed with a different kind of power, one that flowed not through golden trees or sacred rings, but through the beating of wings that could span valleys, and the resonant thunder of voices that could shake mountains from their foundations. At the apex of this ancient order stood Placidusax, the dragon lord whose very name has become synonymous with the majesty and tragedy of his vanished age. He was not merely a dragon, but the dragon lord, chosen by forces beyond mortal comprehension to serve as Elden Lord, in an era when that title carried meanings that subsequent ages would struggle to understand. His form was magnificent beyond the capacity of words to capture, a living mountain of golden stone that moved with the fluid grace of wind itself. The ancient dragons of Placidusax's time were beings fundamentally different from the creatures that would later bear the name of dragon in diminished form. Where their descendants would possess mere flesh and bone, the ancients were armored in scales of living stone, each plate a fragment of eternity itself. These were not mere protective coverings, but conduits of temporal power, scales that possessed the miraculous ability to twist time according to their bearer's will. The nature of this temporal manipulation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the ancient dragon's being. Each scale upon their massive forms contained within it the power to bend the flow of moments, to stretch seconds into hours or compress years into heartbeats. This mastery over time's passage granted them something that all other forms of life could only dream of achieving: true immortality, not the borrowed eternity of undeath or the artificial preservation of magical intervention, but genuine freedom from time's cruel dominion. It was through these miraculous scales that the ancient dragons achieved their legendary status as beings beyond the reach of mortality. Age could not wither them, for they existed outside the stream of years that carried all other creatures toward inevitable endings. Disease could not touch them, for their stone flesh was impervious to the corruptions that plagued mortal forms. Even violence, that universal destroyer of living things, found little purchase against beings who could twist time to heal wounds before they had truly been inflicted. The source of this extraordinary power lay not in the dragons themselves, but in their relationship with a force that transcended all earthly understanding. The greater will, that cosmic intelligence which would later choose the Erdtree as its vessel, had first made contact with the world through these magnificent beings. In the ancient dragons, the greater will found servants whose very nature aligned with its desire to impose order upon the chaotic forces of existence. This divine favor manifested itself most clearly in the greater will's gift of intelligence, to the primitive beasts that shared the world with the dragons. Through its intervention, creatures that had once known only instinct and hunger were elevated to consciousness and purpose. The transformation was marked by a physical change that became the symbol of this elevation. The development of 5-fingered hands, those appendages that would become the mark of true intelligence and the capacity for meaningful action. The significance of 5 fingers in this cosmic ordering cannot be understated. In the Greater Will's design, the number 5 represented perfection of form and function, the ideal arrangement that allowed for maximum dexterity and creative potential. Beings blessed with 5 fingers were granted not just intelligence but the ability to shape their environment, to create tools and structures, to transform raw materials into objects of purpose and beauty. Yet even as the Greater Will bestowed these gifts upon the world's creatures, it was the ancient dragons who remained its primary agents and representatives. They were the living embodiment of divine order, beings whose very existence demonstrated the possibility of transcending the limitations that bound all other forms of life. In their stone scales and temporal mastery, the Greater Will found the perfect expression of its desire to create permanence in a universe defined by change. The dragons' relationship with their divine patron was not one of mere servitude, but of genuine partnership in the cosmic project of ordering reality. They served not because they were compelled to do so, but because their nature aligned perfectly with the Greater Will's vision of how existence should be structured. In them, divine intention found its most perfect earthly expression, a harmony between cosmic will and physical manifestation that would never again be achieved with such completeness. At the heart of this ancient order stood a figure whose identity has been lost to the mists of prehistoric time. This nameless god, the divine vessel through whom the Greater Will's power flowed into the world, chose Placidusax as their Elden Lord, granting him authority over all the ancient dragons and responsibility for maintaining the cosmic order that the Greater Will had established. The relationship between Placidusax and this mysterious deity represented something unprecedented in the history of divine rule. Unlike the gods who would follow, who often demanded blind obedience and unquestioning sacrifice from their servants, the nameless god appears to have been a true partner to their dragon lord. The bond between them was one of mutual respect and shared purpose, a recognition that both divine wisdom and temporal power were necessary for the proper ordering of existence. This partnership found its most concrete expression in the ancient Elden Ring, that cosmic mandala which served as both symbol and mechanism of divine rule. The version of the Elden Ring that existed during the Age of Dragons was markedly different from the one that would later be associated with Marika and her Golden Order, where the later ring would be characterized by the latticed patterns that spoke of careful reconstruction and deliberate binding. The ancient ring was adorned with root-like appendages that suggested growth, expansion, and organic development. These roots that descended from the ancient Elden Ring were more than mere decorative elements. They represented the mechanism by which divine power flowed from cosmic source to earthly manifestation. Through these ethereal tendrils, the nameless god's will was transmitted to the world below, creating the stable foundation upon which the age of ancient dragons was built. The ring served as both crown and conduit, marking its bearer as the chosen representative of forces beyond mortal comprehension, while also providing them with the practical means to exercise that divine authority. The structure of power that emerged from this arrangement was remarkably stable and enduring, unlike the later ages, which would be characterized by constant struggle and periodic upheaval. The age of ancient dragons appears to have been marked by a kind of eternal equilibrium. The dragons, secure in their immortality and confident in their divine mandate, created a form of civilization that was both majestic and serene. Their society was built around principles of order and hierarchy that reflected the cosmic structures they served. Each dragon had their place within the greater whole, their role determined not by personal ambition or political maneuvering, but by their nature and abilities. The greatest among them served as direct agents of Placidusax's will, while the lesser dragons fulfilled supporting roles that were no less important for being subordinate. This hierarchical arrangement was not oppressive but organic, reflecting the natural order that the greater will sought to establish throughout creation. Just as the roots of the ancient Elden Ring grew according to patterns that served the greater whole while allowing for individual variation, so too did Draconic society allow for personal expression within a framework of collective purpose. The dragon's mastery over time gave their civilization a character unlike any that would follow. Projects could be undertaken on timescales that spanned geological ages, for their architects and builders possessed the luxury of literal eternities in which to perfect their work. The great structures they raised were not built in haste or desperation, but with the patient care of beings who knew they would endure to see their creations reach full maturity. Their knowledge, too, was accumulated over periods that dwarfed the entire histories of later civilizations. Each dragon was a library unto themselves, their immortal memories preserving wisdom and understanding that had been gathered across countless millennia. This accumulated knowledge was not hoarded, but shared freely among their kind. For beings blessed with eternity had no need to jealously guard secrets that could be explored and developed over unlimited time. Yet even in this seemingly perfect arrangement, there existed the seeds of future tragedy. The very perfection of the ancient dragon's existence, their complete security in their immortal nature and divine favor, may have made them unprepared for the possibility of change. They had grown accustomed to permanence, to the assumption that what had always been would always continue to be. The nameless god who had chosen Placidusax, who had established the ancient order and blessed it with divine favor, possessed their own will and their own mysterious purposes. Though the bond between deity and dragon lord appeared unshakable, it was ultimately subject to forces and considerations that even Placidusax could not fully comprehend. The god who had elevated the dragons to their exalted position retained the power to withdraw that elevation, to pursue new visions and establish new orders according to their inscrutable wisdom. As the eons passed in their measured procession, subtle changes began to manifest in the cosmic order that the ancient dragons had served so faithfully. The greater will, that ultimate source of all divine authority, was itself evolving in its understanding of how existence should be structured. New possibilities were emerging, new forms of order that might serve its purposes more effectively than the static perfection of the Dragon Age. The first signs of these changes were so subtle that even the dragon's acute senses and temporal mastery might have failed to detect them. Like the first hairline cracks that appear in stone before a great avalanche, these initial alterations in the cosmic order seemed insignificant, easily dismissed as temporary fluctuations in forces that had remained constant for geological ages. But change, once begun, possesses its own momentum. What starts as the slightest deviation from established patterns can grow and amplify until it transforms the entire structure within which it occurs. The ancient dragons, for all their wisdom and power, were perhaps too closely bound to the existing order to recognize the magnitude of the transformation that was beginning to unfold around them. The greater will's attention was beginning to turn toward new possibilities, new forms of existence that might better serve its cosmic purposes. The perfect stability of the Dragon Age, which had once seemed like the ultimate achievement of divine ordering, was starting to appear as a limitation rather than a strength. Permanence, for all its virtues, could also represent stagnation, an inability to adapt and grow in response to changing cosmic conditions. In the vast intelligence of the greater will, new visions were taking shape. Visions of beings who might be more flexible than the dragons, more capable of change and adaptation while still serving the cause of cosmic order. These new concepts would eventually coalesce into plans for entirely different forms of civilization, built around principles that had not yet been explored in the long history of divine rule. The ancient dragons, secure in their stone scales and temporal mastery, continued their eternal vigil, unaware that the foundations of their world were beginning to shift beneath them. Their nameless god maintained the appearance of commitment to the established order, continuing to work through the ancient Elden Ring and its root-like extensions to maintain the cosmic harmony that had characterized their shared rule. Yet somewhere in the depths of divine consciousness, decisions were being made that would reshape the entire nature of existence in the world below. The age that had seemed eternal was approaching its end, though that ending would come not through conquest or catastrophe, but through the far more subtle process of divine abandonment. The ancient dragons had served faithfully, had maintained the order they had been charged to preserve, had demonstrated the virtues of permanence and stability that the greater will had once valued above all else. But faithfulness, for all its nobility, is not always enough to prevent the beloved from departing in search of new experiences and new forms of relationship. The tragedy that was approaching would not be one of failure, but of success that had become too complete, of perfection that had grown too perfect to remain interesting to minds that operated on cosmic scales. The ancient dragons would not fall because they had proven unworthy, but because they had proven their worth so thoroughly that their divine patron had begun to take their excellence for granted. As the prehistoric age drew toward its close, Placidusax continued his patient rule. His golden scales still twisted time according to his will. His many heads still surveyed the domains that stretched beyond every horizon. Around him, his fellow dragons maintained their eternal vigil, their stone forms marking the boundaries of a realm where time moved according to different laws than those that governed the rest of existence. None of them could have imagined that their greatest trial lay not in the future but in the present moment, in decisions being made by the very God they served with such unwavering loyalty. The end of their age would come not as a dramatic conclusion but as a gradual abandonment, a divine departure that would leave them stranded in a world that no longer recognized their authority or understood their purpose. The stones would remember, though the histories would not. The scales that twisted time would preserve echoes of this vanished age, creating spaces where the ancient order could persist even as the world around it transformed beyond recognition. In hidden places and forgotten moments, the age of ancient dragons would continue its eternal existence, waiting for those wise enough to seek it out and strong enough to endure the truth of what had been lost. High above the earthbound realm, where storms gather like ancient memories and stone architecture defies the very laws that govern mortal construction, there exists a place that time has touched with both preservation and destruction. Farum Azula, the crumbling city of the Dragon Lord, hangs suspended in an eternal tempest, its magnificent spires and impossible bridges bearing witness to the glory that once defined the age of ancient dragons and the tragedy that followed its ending. This floating citadel is not merely a city, but a monument to concepts that transcend human understanding, a place where the normal rules of existence bend and warp under the influence of powers that predate the very notion of mortality. Every stone within its boundaries has been touched by temporal forces. Every arch and column constructed according to principles that recognize no distinction between past, present, and future. Here, in this realm beyond time, the ancient dragons created their greatest architectural achievement and their most enduring prison. The approach to Farum Azula reveals immediately that this is no ordinary settlement, no mere collection of buildings assembled for the convenience of their inhabitants. The city's architecture rises in impossible spirals, its towers and bridges connected by geometries that hurt the mind to contemplate. Staircases climb toward platforms that exist at angles that should not be sustainable, while great halls extend in directions that seem to fold back upon themselves. This is not the result of poor planning or architectural failure, but the deliberate expression of minds that thought in dimensions beyond the three that constrain ordinary construction. The materials from which Farum Azula was built speak to the incredible resources and techniques available to its creators. These are not the dressed stones of human masonry, but living rock that has been shaped by forces more fundamental than hammer and chisel. Each block has been infused with the temporal energies that the ancient dragons commanded, creating building materials that exist in a state of perpetual becoming, neither fully solid nor entirely ethereal. The result is a city that seems to shimmer at the edges of perception, its forms shifting subtly as the observer's attention moves across its surfaces. Within the city's geological strata, embedded like fossils in layers of primordial stone, lie the remains of ancient dragons whose deaths preceded even the construction of the floating citadel. These entombed beings are not merely buried within Farum Azula's foundations, but have become part of its essential structure, their stone scales and temporal essences contributing to the city's ability to exist outside the normal flow of time. The discovery of these ancient remains reveals that Farum Azula itself may be built upon the bones of an even older civilization, layer upon layer of Draconic history compressed into the foundations of the city that would become their greatest monument. The entombed dragons display characteristics that mark them as beings of incredible age and power, their forms preserved in stone that has been shaped by forces beyond mere death and decay. Some retain the 4 wings and 4 limbs that marked the greatest of their kind, while others show signs of the multiple heads that seem to have been characteristic of the ancient dragon's leadership caste. These buried titans are not arranged randomly within the city's strata, but follow patterns that suggest deliberate placement, as if their entombment was part of some grand design that connected their eternal rest to the city's temporal properties. The examination of these geological layers reveals that Farum Azula has experienced multiple phases of construction and reconstruction across eons that span the entire history of Draconic civilization. Each stratum tells its own story of architectural achievement and temporal manipulation, creating a vertical timeline that can be read like the rings of an ancient tree. The deepest layers show evidence of the earliest attempts to harness temporal forces for architectural purposes, while the upper levels display the refined mastery that characterized the height of ancient dragon civilization. Most remarkably, the presence of these entombed dragons appears to be directly connected to Farum Azula's ability to exist outside normal temporal flows. Their stone scales, infused with the time-twisting properties that granted the ancient dragons their immortality, continue to function even in death, creating pockets of temporal distortion that allow the city to maintain its impossible existence. The cumulative effect of so many sources of temporal manipulation has created a place where time moves according to entirely different principles than those that govern the world below. This temporal distortion is most pronounced in the deepest chambers of Farum Azula, where the concentration of entombed dragons reaches its peak. Here, the very air seems thick with chronological anomalies, creating spaces where moments stretch into hours and years compress into heartbeats. Visitors to these depths report experiencing memories that are not their own, visions of events that occurred in ages long past, as if the concentrated temporal energy of the entombed dragons has created windows into the history that their city has witnessed. The architecture of Farum Azula itself reflects this temporal complexity, with different sections of the city existing in various states of temporal flow. Some areas experience accelerated time, causing rapid weathering and decay that gives them their characteristic crumbling appearance. Others exist in pockets of slowed time, preserving ancient structures in states of near-perfect conservation. The result is a city that displays every stage of its own history simultaneously, from newly constructed magnificence to advanced ruin, all coexisting within the same impossible space. The bridges and walkways that connect Farum Azula's various sections demonstrate the ancient dragon's complete mastery over spatial as well as temporal forces. These structures span distances that should be impossible for stonework to achieve, yet they remain stable despite their impossible proportions and the constant buffeting of the eternal storm that surrounds the city. The secret to their stability lies not in conventional engineering, but in their integration with the temporal fields that permeate the entire city, creating supports and reinforcements that exist outside normal space. At the heart of Farum Azula lies the Dragon Temple, a structure so vast and complex that it seems to contain entire landscapes within its walls. This sacred space is dominated by the skeletal remains of an ancient dragon, so enormous that it dwarfs even the mighty Placidusax. Its bones arranged in a configuration that suggests this was not merely a burial, but a deliberate transformation of death into an architectural element. The dragon's ribcage forms natural arches and vaulted ceilings, while its spine creates a central aisle that leads toward an altar where the greatest mysteries of Draconic faith were once contemplated. The size of this entombed dragon speaks to the incredible scale on which ancient dragon civilization operated. This was not merely a large member of their species, but a titan whose very existence challenged the boundaries of what flesh and bone could achieve. The careful positioning of its remains within the temple suggests that its death was not an ending, but a transformation, a willing sacrifice that allowed the dragon's essence to become part of the sacred space that would serve as the spiritual center of their civilization. Throughout the Dragon Temple, smaller shrines and alcoves contain statues and reliefs that depict the relationship between the ancient dragons and their devoted servants. Beast clergymen are shown in attitudes of reverence and worship, their forms carved with exquisite detail that captures both their bestial nature and their elevated consciousness. These artistic representations provide glimpses into the complex social structure that characterized ancient dragon civilization, revealing a hierarchical system based not on domination but on mutual respect and shared purpose. The storm that surrounds Farum Azula is not merely a meteorological phenomenon but a manifestation of the same temporal forces that allow the city to exist outside normal time. This eternal tempest serves multiple functions within the city's complex systems, providing both protection from unwanted intrusion and a visible symbol of the power that the ancient dragons commanded. The storm's winds carry not just rain and lightning, but temporal distortions that can transport objects and beings across vast distances and chronological spans. The visual appearance of this storm perfectly embodies the concept of scales that twist time, with its spiral patterns and recursive geometries, creating a three-dimensional representation of temporal manipulation. The storm clouds themselves seem to fold and unfold in patterns that mirror the twisted scales of the ancient dragons, suggesting that the weather phenomenon may have been deliberately shaped by their power into a form that reflected their essential nature. Within the eye of this eternal storm lies Placidusax's arena, a space so thoroughly removed from normal temporal flow that it exists in a state of perpetual transition between past and future. Accessing this space requires a form of temporal surrender, a willingness to abandon one's fixed position in time and become part of the fluid chronology that characterizes Farum Azula's deepest mysteries. The act of lying down in one of the shallow graves that dot the arena's approach is not mere rest, but a form of temporal meditation that allows the visitor to align themselves with the city's impossible timeline. These graves, carved into the stone platforms that surround the arena, are not traditional burial sites, but temporal anchors that allow living beings to interface with the chronological complexities that define Placidusax's domain. Each grave is precisely shaped to accommodate a human form, though they lack the skeletal remains that would indicate actual burial. Instead, they serve as gateways, allowing those who rest within them to experience the temporal fluidity that characterizes existence in the heart of the storm. The journey through time that begins when one lies within these graves is not a simple reversal of chronological flow, but a complex navigation through multiple temporal layers that exist simultaneously within Placidusax's arena. The traveler experiences the city as it was in its prime, witnesses the gradual decay that has characterized its long decline, and glimpses possible futures that may yet come to pass. This temporal multiplicity creates a form of existence that transcends the simple progression from past to future that defines normal experience. In this space beyond time, the boundaries between different chronological periods become permeable, allowing for interactions and interventions that would be impossible under normal temporal conditions. It is here that Miquella's needle can achieve its full potential, using the concentrated temporal energies of the arena to unweave the influences of outer gods that have become embedded in the very fabric of an individual's existence. The needle's ability to function fully in this location demonstrates the incredible concentration of temporal force that Placidusax's presence generates. The mechanics of how Miquella's needle achieves its curative effects in this location reveal important truths about the nature of divine influence and temporal manipulation. The outer god's power appears to operate through a form of chronological embedding, inserting their influence into the timeline of their victims in ways that make it seem as though corruption has always existed. By operating in a space where multiple timelines coexist and intermingle, the needle can access points in the victim's personal chronology before the corruption took hold, effectively editing their temporal experience to remove the unwanted influence. This capability suggests that the ancient dragon's mastery over time extended far beyond simple manipulation of duration and sequence to encompass the fundamental structure of causality itself. In Placidusax's arena, cause and effect become fluid concepts, allowing for interventions that can retroactively prevent events that have already occurred from the perspective of normal temporal flow. This represents a level of temporal mastery that approaches the godlike, demonstrating why the ancient dragons were once able to serve as effective agents of cosmic order. The fact that this temporal manipulation continues to function even in Placidusax's apparent death reveals the profound nature of the connection between the ancient dragons and the forces they commanded. Their mastery over time was not merely a learned skill or divine gift, but an essential aspect of their being, so fundamental to their existence that it persists even when their consciousness and agency have been diminished or destroyed. The arena serves as a monument to this enduring power, a space where the last echoes of ancient Draconic authority continue to reshape reality according to their will. The storm that maintains this temporal complexity appears to be self-sustaining, drawing power from sources that transcend the physical presence of its creators. The twisting patterns of wind and cloud that characterize the eternal tempest seem to feed upon the temporal distortions they create, generating new sources of chronological disruption that perpetuate their own existence. This creates a feedback loop that ensures the storm's continuation even as the city it protects continues to crumble and decay. The crumbling of Farum Azula itself tells the story of a civilization's gradual decline, not through conquest or catastrophe, but through the slow erosion of purpose and meaning that characterizes all abandoned places. The city's impossible architecture, deprived of the conscious will that once maintained its structural integrity, has begun to succumb to forces that operate according to more conventional physical laws. Yet even this decay follows patterns that reflect the temporal complexities that define the city's existence, with different sections deteriorating at rates that correspond to their position within the overall chronological matrix. Fragments of Farum Azula can be found scattered throughout the lands between, carried there by the winds of the eternal storm, or deposited during periods when the temporal distortions that maintain the city's altitude have weakened. These fragments retain traces of the temporal energies that once flowed through the complete structure, making them valuable components for magical practices that require manipulation of time and space. The presence of these scattered pieces throughout the world below serves as a constant reminder of the floating city's existence and the power that its creators once commanded. The meteorite that struck Farum Azula during its long history added another layer of complexity to the city's already intricate temporal matrix. This celestial projectile brought with it gravitational forces that interact with the existing chronological distortions in ways that have fundamentally altered the nature of the city's existence. The impact created new forms of spatial warping that complement the temporal manipulations already present, resulting in an environment where the normal rules of both time and space operate according to entirely different principles. The gravitational effects of this meteorite strike can be seen throughout Farum Azula in the form of architectural impossibilities that exceed even the remarkable achievements of the city's original construction. Structures now exist that seem to violate the basic principles of physics, with masses supported by forces that operate outside conventional understanding. These gravitational anomalies work in concert with the temporal distortions to create spaces that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, adding yet another layer to the city's already complex relationship with reality. The purple energy that characterizes the meteorite's continuing influence manifests throughout Farum Azula as visible distortions in the fabric of space itself. These energy patterns create corridors and chambers that seem to exist partially outside normal three-dimensional space, allowing for forms of movement and perception that transcend ordinary limitations. The interaction between this gravitational magic and the pre-existing temporal forces has created new possibilities for existence that even the ancient dragons may not have originally intended. The ruins of Farum Azula thus represent not merely the decay of a great civilization, but the ongoing evolution of forces that continue to operate according to principles that transcend the understanding of later ages. The city serves as a laboratory where temporal, gravitational, and architectural forces continue to interact in ways that generate new forms of complexity and possibility. Even in its decline, Farum Azula remains a place where the impossible becomes routine and the boundaries of reality are constantly being redrawn by forces that acknowledge no limitations, save those they impose upon themselves. In the shadow of the ancient dragon's magnificent dominion, in the spaces between their vast wings and beneath the sheltering bulk of their stone-scaled forms, there flourished a civilization that would prove to be among the most devoted servants that any divine order has ever known. These were the Beastmen of Farum Azula, beings whose very existence represented the greater will's capacity to transform the raw materials of instinct and appetite into something approaching the sacred, creatures who had been lifted from the realm of mindless hunger into the elevated sphere of conscious worship and purposeful service. The transformation that elevated these primitive beasts into the intelligent beastmen who would serve as the ancient dragon's most faithful clergymen represents one of the Greater Will's most remarkable achievements in the art of divine intervention. Where once there had been creatures driven solely by the basic imperatives of survival and reproduction, there emerged beings capable of contemplating abstract concepts, creating works of lasting beauty, and dedicating their entire existence to the service of powers far greater than themselves. This transformation was not merely a matter of enhanced intelligence, but a fundamental reconstruction of the very nature of bestial existence. The Greater Will's intervention reached into the deepest structures of their being, reshaping not only their mental capacities, but their physical forms to better serve their new roles as intermediaries between the divine and the mundane. The most visible sign of this transformation was the development of five-fingered hands, those miraculous appendages that represented the pinnacle of divine favor and the key to unlocking the full potential of intelligent life. The significance of the five-fingered hand in the Greater Will's cosmic ordering cannot be overstated. In the divine mathematics that govern the cosmos, the number 5 represented completeness and perfection, the ideal balance between the simplicity of basic function and the complexity necessary for advanced manipulation of the physical world. Beings blessed with 5 fingers were granted not merely the ability to grasp and hold, but the capacity to create, to shape raw materials according to conscious design, to transform the world around them through the application of will and skill. The cinquedia, that ceremonial weapon whose very name celebrated the miracle of 5 fingers, served as both practical tool and sacred symbol for the beast clergymen who had been chosen for the highest ranks of their order. This blade, with its distinctive design that incorporated 5 skeletal fingers into its very structure, represented the transformation that the Greater Will had worked upon their kind, elevating them from the realm of mere beasts into the sacred category of beings capable of conscious devotion and intelligent service. The bestowal of intelligence upon the Beastmen was accompanied by a parallel gift that would prove equally important in their development as servants of divine order: the knowledge of stone working and tool creation. The first implements wielded by these newly conscious beings were crude stones, shaped by instinct as much as by design. But even these primitive tools represented a revolutionary advance in their capacity to interact with their environment. From these humble beginnings would emerge a tradition of craftsmanship that would eventually produce works of art and utility that rivaled the achievements of any civilization. The curved swords that became the signature weapons of the Beastmen represent the pinnacle of their metallurgical achievement. Blades forged from materials that possessed the seemingly contradictory qualities of being both dull in appearance and supremely effective in combat. These weapons, crafted from iron that had been worked according to techniques passed down through generations of beastsmiths, achieved a level of functional perfection that compensated for their unprepossessing appearance through their remarkable balance and cutting ability. The design principles that governed these weapons reflected the Beastmen's practical approach to the challenges of their existence, prioritizing effectiveness and reliability over mere aesthetic appeal. Each blade was shaped not according to arbitrary standards of beauty, but according to mathematical principles that maximized its utility as a tool of protection and service. The result was weaponry that could be wielded with devastating effect by beings whose physical strength far exceeded that of ordinary mortals, yet which remained controllable and precise in the hands of skilled practitioners. Beyond their skill with blades, the Beastmen developed a unique mastery over projectile weapons that seemed to defy the conventional understanding of ballistics and trajectory. Their throwing weapons, crafted with the same attention to functional perfection that characterized all their metalwork, possessed the remarkable ability to return to their wielders after striking their targets, following paths through the air that seemed to violate the basic principles of physics. This seemingly magical property was not the result of supernatural intervention, but of incredibly sophisticated understanding of aerodynamics and materials science, knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of patient experimentation and refinement. The Beastmen's architectural achievements, visible throughout the ruins of Farum Azula, demonstrate their capacity to work on scales that matched the ambitions of their Draconic masters. The great halls and soaring bridges that characterized the floating city required not only technical skill, but organizational ability of the highest order, for such massive undertakings could only be completed through the coordinated efforts of thousands of workers operating according to detailed plans that spanned decades or even centuries in their execution. The integration of temporal elements into their architectural projects reveals the depth of the Beastmen's understanding of the forces that govern their world, working alongside beings who could manipulate time itself. They learned to create structures that existed in harmony with temporal distortions, buildings that could maintain their integrity even when subjected to the chronological stresses that characterized life in Farum Azula. Their mastery of this hybrid architecture represents one of the most sophisticated achievements in the history of construction, requiring not only technical skill but philosophical understanding of the relationship between space, time, and material form. The religious architecture of Farum Azula, with its countless shrines, temples, and places of worship, provides the most complete picture of the Beastmen's spiritual development under the guidance of their Draconic masters. These sacred spaces were designed not merely as places of assembly, but as environments that could facilitate direct communion between worshippers and the divine forces they served. Every arch, every column, every decorative element was positioned according to principles that enhanced the flow of spiritual energy and created conditions conducive to religious experience. The statuary that adorns these sacred spaces reveals the complexity of the relationship between the Beastmen and their Draconic overlords, depicting scenes of reverence and service that transcend simple domination to suggest genuine mutual respect and affection. The beast clergymen are shown in attitudes of worship that convey not fear or subservience, but joyful dedication to purposes that they understood and embraced. These artistic representations provide glimpses into a form of religious experience that was based on love rather than intimidation, devotion rather than mere obedience. The development of red lightning techniques among the beast clergymen represents perhaps the most remarkable achievement in their spiritual education, for this power was not merely granted to them but taught through patient instruction by their Draconic masters. The ability to channel and direct electrical forces that had previously been the exclusive province of the ancient dragons marked the highest level of trust and integration that could be achieved between two species, a sharing of power that transcended the boundaries of species and natural ability. The mastery of red lightning required not only technical skill but spiritual preparation that could take decades to complete. The beast clergymen who achieved this level of power had to undergo transformations of consciousness that allowed them to align their mental and physical processes with forces that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those that governed ordinary electrical phenomena. The red lightning of the ancient dragons was not merely a more powerful form of conventional electricity, but a manifestation of temporal and spiritual energies that required perfect harmony between wielder and weapon to control. Effectively, those beastmen who achieved the rank of chosen, marked by their ability to wield weapons infused with the red lightning of their masters, became living bridges between the mortal and divine realms, beings who could serve as conduits for powers that transcended ordinary understanding. Their bodies became vessels for energies that existed partially outside normal space and time, a transformation that granted them capabilities far beyond those of their unenhanced brethren, but which also imposed burdens and responsibilities that few could comprehend. The burial customs practiced by the Beastmen reveal a sophisticated understanding of death as transformation rather than termination, reflecting philosophical concepts that they had absorbed from their association with beings who existed outside the normal flow of time. Their funerary practices involved not merely the disposal of remains, but elaborate rituals designed to facilitate the transition of consciousness from physical to spiritual existence. Ceremonies that could span weeks or months in their careful attention to every detail of the process. The practice of jar burial, evidenced by the countless ceramic vessels that dot the landscape of Farum Azula, represents one of the most distinctive aspects of Beastmen funeral traditions. These containers were not merely receptacles for remains, but carefully crafted vessels designed to preserve and protect the spiritual essence of the deceased during their transition to whatever form of existence awaited beyond death. Each jar was shaped according to principles that reflected the individual character and achievements of its intended occupant, creating a form of personalized afterlife that honored the unique contributions each beastman had made to their civilization. The theory that these burial jars were crafted from earth that had been infused with the essence of entombed ancient dragons provides insight into the profound spiritual connections that bound the beastmen to their masters even in death. If this speculation proves accurate, then every funeral urn represented a form of communion between the mortal remains of the servant and the immortal essence of the served, a mingling of spiritual energies that ensured the continuity of their relationship beyond the boundaries of physical existence. The transformation of these sacred burial vessels into shields reveals the practical spirituality that characterized Beastmen culture, their ability to find religious significance in even the most mundane activities. The jar shields that protected beast warriors in combat were not merely repurposed funeral equipment, but consecrated items that carried the blessings of the dead into battle, armor that provided not only physical protection, but spiritual strength drawn from the accumulated wisdom and courage of departed ancestors. The presence of human figures in the architectural reliefs of Farum Azula raises fascinating questions about the diversity of beings that were incorporated into the ancient Draconic order. These carved representations suggest that even during the prehistoric age, when dragons ruled supreme, there were human populations that had achieved sufficient recognition to be deemed worthy of inclusion in the sacred art that adorned the most important buildings of the floating city. The two most likely candidates for these early human populations are the Numen, those mysterious beings whose origins lay beyond the boundaries of the known world, and the descendants of ancient dragons who had undergone some form of transformation that allowed them to take human form. The Numen's status as outsiders who had arrived from another realm would make them natural allies of the Greater Will, whose own origin lay beyond the confines of the physical world. Their inclusion in Farum Azula's sacred spaces might reflect their role as intermediaries between the cosmic forces represented by the Greater Will and the earthbound reality inhabited by dragons and beastmen. The alternative theory, that these humans were descendants of dragons who had learned to assume mortal form, finds support in the descriptions of certain human populations whose characteristics suggest draconic ancestry. The references to stony faces and shortened lifespans compared to the ancients could indicate a form of controlled transformation, a voluntary acceptance of mortality, in exchange for the ability to interact more easily with beings of limited lifespan and perspective. The architectural incorporation of beastmen remains into the very structure of Farum Azula's buildings, represents a practice that might seem macabre to modern sensibilities, but which reflected the deep spiritual beliefs that governed their civilization. The entombment of living beings within the walls and foundations of important structures was not an act of cruelty, but a form of willing sacrifice, a recognition that the most important buildings required not merely physical materials but spiritual essence to achieve their full potential. This practice of immurement, while sharing superficial similarities with punitive traditions known from other cultures, appears to have been entirely voluntary among the Beastmen, representing the ultimate expression of devotion to the greater good of their civilization. Those who chose to become part of the architecture they had helped to build achieved a form of immortality that transcended individual existence, their consciousness becoming part of the larger spiritual matrix that gave Farum Azula its unique character and temporal properties. The relationship between the Beastmen and their human contemporaries in Farum Azula appears to have been one of mutual respect and cooperation rather than competition or conflict. The architectural evidence suggests that both species contributed their unique skills and perspectives to the creation of the floating city, with humans perhaps serving in roles that required different forms of intelligence or dexterity than those at which the Beastmen excelled. This early example of interspecies cooperation provides a model for the forms of collaboration that would characterize the most successful civilizations of later ages. The gradual transformation of beast society from its prehistoric roots to its fully developed form as the servant class of the ancient Draconic order represents one of the most remarkable examples of guided evolution in the history of conscious development. Under the patient tutelage of their Draconic masters and the overarching guidance of the Greater Will, the Beastmen developed from creatures driven solely by instinct to beings capable of sophisticated thought, complex emotions, and abstract reasoning. This evolution was not imposed from without, but emerged naturally from the interplay between the Beastmen's innate capacities and the opportunities for growth provided by their environment. The ancient dragons served not as tyrants demanding obedience, but as teachers offering instruction, guides who helped their servants discover and develop potentials that had always existed within them, but which required external stimulus to manifest fully. The loyalty that characterized the relationship between Beastmen and dragons was not the blind obedience of slaves to masters, but the conscious devotion of students to beloved teachers, servants to honored lords, worshippers to revered deities. This loyalty was earned through centuries of patient instruction and mutual benefit, creating bonds that transcended species, boundaries, and individual self-interest to encompass shared commitment to cosmic principles that both groups recognized as worthy of their highest devotion. The legacy of this relationship would endure long after the age of ancient dragons had passed into memory, influencing the forms of service and devotion that would characterize later civilizations. The Beastmen's example of loyal service without servility, of intelligent obedience that enhanced rather than diminished their essential nature, would provide a template for relationships between superior and subordinate beings that emphasized growth and mutual benefit rather than domination and exploitation. As the prehistoric age drew toward its close, and the forces that would reshape the world began to gather strength, the Beastmen found themselves confronted with changes that challenged everything they had learned about the nature of divine service and cosmic order. The mysterious departure of their master's god, the gradual abandonment of Farum Azula by its draconic inhabitants, and the emergence of new forms of divine authority, all combined to create a crisis that tested their fundamental understanding of their place in the cosmic scheme. The response of the Beastmen to this crisis would demonstrate both the strength of their character and the depth of their spiritual development. Rather than despair at the apparent failure of the order they had served so faithfully, many would adapt their skills and devotion to new forms of service, finding ways to honor their ancient commitments while embracing the opportunities presented by a changing world. Their ability to transfer their loyalty from the dragons they had served to new masters while maintaining their essential character and values would prove to be one of their greatest achievements, demonstrating that true devotion transcends the particular forms it takes to encompass the underlying principles it serves. In the depths of prehistory, where memory fades into legend and legend dissolves into the silence of stones, there occurred an event so profound in its implications that it would reshape the very foundations of existence, yet so shrouded in mystery that its true nature remains hidden beneath layers of speculation and conjecture. This was the departure of the nameless god, that divine being who had chosen Placidusax as Elden Lord, and had presided over the golden age of ancient dragons with wisdom and benevolence that seemed as eternal as the stone scales of their chosen servants. The manner of this departure, whether voluntary abandonment or tragic necessity, whether planned transition or desperate flight, has been lost to the mists of time that even the dragon's temporal mastery could not preserve. What remains is only the devastating fact of absence. Where once there had been presence, silence, where once there had been divine communion, and the terrible stillness of Placidusax waiting in his storm-racked arena for a return that would never come to pass. The consequences of this abandonment rippled outward from Farum Azula like the waves generated by a stone dropped into still water, but these were waves that moved through the fabric of reality itself, carrying with them transformations that would touch every aspect of existence in ways both subtle and profound. The ancient Elden Ring, that cosmic mandala which had served as the symbol and mechanism of divine authority, found itself bereft of the consciousness that had given it purpose and direction. Its root-like appendages no longer channels for divine will, but empty conduits waiting for new forms of power to flow through their ethereal passages. The theory that emerges from careful consideration of the available evidence suggests that the nameless god did not simply vanish into the cosmic void, but underwent a transformation so complete that it amounted to a form of death, a dissolution of individual consciousness that left behind only the raw materials from which new forms of divine existence might eventually emerge. This death, if death it was, would not have been the simple cessation of existence but a process of cosmic recycling, the transformation of one form of divine energy into the seeds from which entirely different structures of power and meaning could grow. The mechanism by which this transformation occurred finds its most compelling explanation in the behavior of ordinary souls when they depart their physical vessels, for even the humblest mortal leaves behind traces of their essence in the form of golden saplings, those luminous manifestations that mark the spots where consciousness has returned to the cosmic source from which it originally emerged. If such modest souls can produce visible signs of their passing, how much more dramatic would be the aftermath of a god's dissolution? How much more profound the transformation that would result from the return of truly cosmic consciousness to the primordial matrix of existence? The Elden Ring that departed with the nameless god carried within its structure not merely the accumulated power of divine authority, but the concentrated essence of an entire age, the distilled wisdom and experience of eons spent in the careful ordering of reality according to principles that had seemed as permanent as the laws of physics themselves. When this cosmic artifact found its way into the depths of the earth, when its root-like appendages finally took hold in the fertile darkness beneath the world's surface, the result was not merely the growth of another divine symbol, but the birth of something unprecedented in the history of existence. This was the primordial crucible, that legendary cauldron of transformation, where all the scattered elements of life would be drawn together and blended into new forms of unprecedented complexity and potential. The crucible was not a place in any ordinary sense, but a process, a cosmic event that unfolded across vast stretches of time and space, drawing together the remnants of the ancient order and the raw materials of future possibility into combinations that had never before been attempted or achieved. The red-gold color that characterized the primordial crucible provides one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for its connection to the departed dragons and their vanished god, for this was the same hue that had marked the red lightning wielded by the ancient dragons, the same tint that would later be associated with the fundamental forces of life and growth. This color was not merely aesthetic but symbolic, representing the synthesis of opposing forces that had previously existed in careful balance, but which were now being combined into entirely new arrangements of power and meaning. The roots that descended from the ancient Elden Ring found their perfect expression in the great root systems that would eventually become the foundation for the most ambitious architectural project in the history of divine intervention, the Erdtree itself. These roots, no longer mere conduits for existing divine will, but active agents of transformation and growth, began the slow process of drawing together all the scattered elements of life and consciousness that had been left adrift by the departure of their ancient organizing principle. The deep root depths, those shadowy caverns that lie beneath the eventual site of the Erdtree, represent the physical manifestation of this cosmic process of gathering and consolidation. Here, in chambers carved not by conventional excavation but by the movement of forces that operated according to principles beyond ordinary comprehension, the roots of the future Erdtree began their work of creating new forms of order from the chaos that had followed the collapse of the ancient system. The presence of the fingerprint stone shield in these depths provides tantalizing evidence for one of the most compelling theories about the fate of the nameless god, for this artifact bears the unmistakable marks of divine fingers pressed into stone with such force that the impressions remain visible ages after they were created. The size and configuration of these fingerprints suggest that they were made by a being of truly cosmic proportions, someone whose very touch could leave permanent marks in materials that ordinary force could never affect. The theory that these fingerprints represent the final resting place of the nameless god, that the stone shield marks the location where their physical form finally succumbed to whatever forces had driven them from their ancient throne, provides a satisfying explanation for several otherwise inexplicable mysteries. If the nameless god did indeed die in these depths, if their divine essence was released into the root systems that were already beginning to spread through the underground chambers, then the subsequent growth of the Erdtree becomes not merely a new beginning, but a direct continuation of the ancient order in transformed form. The desecration of this hypothetical tomb by the three fingers, those agents of the frenzied flame who represent the antithesis of all ordered existence, would explain both the presence of their marks on the stone shield and their imprisonment in the chambers below. Their violation of the nameless god's resting place would have been an act of cosmic vandalism, a deliberate attempt to corrupt the process of divine transformation that was taking place in the depths, and their subsequent containment would represent the Erdtree's first act of protective intervention on its own behalf. The Fingerslayer blade, that mysterious weapon forged from the corpse of an unknown god, provides additional support for this theory through its remarkable similarity to the sacred relic sword that would later be carved from the combined remains of Radagon and Marika. The parallel construction of these two weapons suggests that they share not merely similar crafting techniques, but common origins in divine flesh. And if the sacred relic sword represents the physical remains of the Erdtree's god vessel, then the Fingerslayer blade may well represent the transformed remains of their predecessor. The Nox's possession of this weapon, their use of it as a tool for striking back at the greater will that had banished them to their underground exile, creates a poetic justice that spans the ages. If the Fingerslayer blade was indeed crafted from the remains of the nameless god, then the Nox's rebellion against the current order was being carried out using the physical remnants of the previous order, a form of cosmic irony that would appeal to minds capable of thinking in terms of geological timescales and civilizational cycles. The transformation of the nameless god's essence into the root systems that would support the Erdtree represents more than mere recycling of divine materials, but a fundamental reimagining of how divine power should be structured and deployed. Where the ancient order had been characterized by hierarchy and clear distinctions between rulers and ruled, the new order that emerged from the primordial crucible emphasized integration and synthesis, the blending of previously separate elements into new forms of unprecedented complexity. This philosophical shift from segregation to integration found its most visible expression in the creatures and phenomena that emerged from the crucible's transformative processes. The omen and misbegotten, those beings whose forms combined characteristics from multiple species in ways that defied traditional categories, represented not aberrations or mistakes but successful experiments in the creation of new forms of life that transcended the limitations of their component parts. The aspects of the crucible, wings, horns, scales, feathers, and fangs, that would later be dismissed as signs of devolution and corruption were originally intended as evidence of evolution and advancement, proof that life was no longer constrained by the rigid categories that had defined existence during the age of ancient dragons. These physical modifications represented the crucible's attempt to create beings who could adapt to any environment, who could combine the strengths of multiple species without being limited by the weaknesses of any single form. The ancient dragon's own participation in these transformative processes, evidenced by Placidusax's random fang growths and the feathered appendages that appeared on some of their descendants, suggests that even the most conservative representatives of the old order were not immune to the changes that were sweeping through the world. Their stone scales, which had once represented the pinnacle of evolutionary achievement, were beginning to show variations and modifications that pointed toward new directions of development. The red-gold coloration that connected the ancient dragon's lightning to the primordial crucible's fundamental hue reveals the deep continuities that existed between the old order and the new, demonstrating that the transformation was not a complete rejection of everything that had come before, but a synthesis that preserved the best elements of the ancient system while opening new possibilities for growth and change. This color became the signature of divine favor in its most creative aspect, marking those beings and phenomena that embodied the crucible's vision of what life might become when freed from artificial constraints. The gradual emergence of the Erdtree from the root systems that had been nourished by the nameless god's transformed essence represents the culmination of a process that had taken geological ages to complete. This was not the sudden appearance of a fully formed divine symbol, but the slow growth of something organic and living, a tree that embodied the principles of the crucible while transcending the chaotic experimentation that had characterized its earlier phases. The Erdtree's golden radiance, so different from the red-gold hue of the crucible, marked the emergence of a new phase in the cosmic process of ordering reality, one that emphasized stability and permanence over change and experimentation. Where the crucible had been characterized by constant flux and endless variation, the Erdtree represented the achievement of a new form of equilibrium, one that could maintain itself without the constant intervention that had been necessary to sustain the ancient order. The selection of Maliketh as the vessel for this new form of divine authority represents the Erdtree's first major policy decision, the choice of a being whose nature embodied the synthesis of elements that the crucible had been working to achieve. Maliketh's dual nature, her ability to exist simultaneously as goddess and mortal, as individual and symbol, made her the perfect intermediary between the cosmic forces represented by the Erdtree and the earthbound creatures who would be subject to its influence. The establishment of the Golden Order under Marika's guidance represented the institutionalization of the principles that had emerged from the primordial crucible's experiments in synthesis and integration. Where the ancient order had been based on clear hierarchies and fixed roles, the Golden Order emphasized flexibility and adaptation, the ability to incorporate new elements and respond to changing circumstances without losing essential coherence or purpose. The fate of Placidusax during this transition from the ancient order to the Golden Order remains one of the most poignant mysteries in the entire saga of divine succession. His vigil in the storm-racked arena of Farum Azula, his patient waiting for a god who would never return, represents not merely personal tragedy but cosmic pathos, the suffering of a being whose loyalty had outlasted the very foundations upon which it was built. The discovery that Placidusax's pose mirrors that of the two fingers when they have been rejected by the Erdtree suggests that even in his abandonment, the Dragon Lord continued to seek connection with the divine forces that had once defined his existence. His multiple heads, reduced from their original 5 to the current 2 through unknown conflicts and losses, echo the progression from the complete hand to the paired fingers that represent the diminished but still meaningful connection between mortal and divine realms. The parallel between Placidusax's diminishment and the two fingers' reduced state provides insight into the nature of divine communication across the ages, suggesting that the relationship between cosmic authorities and their earthbound representatives has always been characterized by gradual erosion and eventual abandonment. The loyalty that binds servants to masters, worshippers to deities, and subjects to rulers contains within itself the seeds of inevitable disappointment, for no relationship can maintain its initial intensity across the vast spans of time that characterize cosmic processes. The transformation of the nameless god into the root systems that nurtured the Erdtree represents perhaps the most complete form of self-sacrifice in the recorded history of divine behavior, a willing dissolution of individual identity in service of principles that transcended personal existence. This sacrifice made possible the emergence of new forms of divine authority that were less dependent on individual personalities and more grounded in systematic principles that could outlast any particular vessel or representative. The irony of this situation is that the very success of the nameless god's sacrifice ensured that their identity and achievements would be forgotten by the civilizations that benefited from their self-destruction. The Erdtree's magnificence, built upon foundations that had been nourished by their dissolved essence, became so overwhelming in its presence that it obscured the very processes that had made its existence possible, creating the illusion that the Golden Order had emerged spontaneously rather than growing from the carefully prepared soil of previous civilizations. The deep continuities that connect the age of ancient dragons to the age of the Erdtree become visible only to those who possess the patience and wisdom to trace the hidden connections that link apparently disparate phenomena across vast spans of time. The roots that descend from both versions of the Elden Ring, the color symbolism that connects Draconic lightning to crucible fire to Erdtree radiance, and the architectural principles that govern both Farum Azula and the Golden Capital all point toward underlying patterns that transcend the surface differences between different ages and orders. The recognition of these patterns provides comfort for those who mourn the passing of the ancient order, for it reveals that nothing of true value has been lost in the cosmic transitions that have reshaped the world. The wisdom of the dragons lives on in the temporal manipulations that characterize Farum Azula's continued existence. Their devotion finds new expression in the loyalty of those who serve the current order, and their mastery over natural forces continues in the techniques and technologies that define contemporary civilization. The ultimate lesson of the nameless God's transformation is that divine love sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice, the willingness to dissolve individual existence in service of principles that transcend personal identity. This sacrifice becomes meaningful not through its recognition or reward, but through its effectiveness in creating conditions where new forms of flourishing become possible, where the rigid limitations of previous orders can give way to experiments in existence that open new possibilities for consciousness and growth. The mystery that surrounds the nameless God's identity and fate serves as a reminder that the most profound acts of love and sacrifice often occur in silence and shadow, without witnesses or chronicles, to preserve their memory for future generations. The gods who seek fame and recognition for their actions may achieve temporary glory, but those who act without regard for personal aggrandizement create changes that endure long after all memory of their individual contributions has faded into the background noise of cosmic history. As the age of ancient dragons gave way to the new order established under the golden radiance of the Erdtree, the faithful servants who had once devoted their lives to the service of stone-scaled masters found themselves confronted with a crisis of purpose that transcended mere unemployment to encompass the fundamental question of identity itself. These were beings whose entire existence had been defined by their relationship to powers that had now departed or transformed beyond recognition, creatures whose loyalty had been so complete that the absence of appropriate objects for their devotion threatened to unmake the very foundations of their being. The greater will, in its infinite capacity for recognizing and utilizing existing resources, perceived in these displaced servants not a problem to be solved, but an opportunity to be seized. The same qualities that had made the Beastmen such exemplary servants of the ancient dragons, their unwavering loyalty, their capacity for intelligent action, their willingness to sacrifice personal interest for greater purposes, made them ideal candidates for roles in the new cosmic order that was taking shape around the growing influence of the Erdtree. The concept of shadows that emerged from this transition represents one of the most sophisticated solutions to the challenge of managing powerful beings who might otherwise pose threats to established order. Rather than simply discarding the ancient servants or attempting to suppress their capabilities, the Greater Will chose to redirect their energies toward new forms of service that would benefit from their experience, while ensuring their continued loyalty to the cosmic principles that transcended any particular manifestation of divine authority. The transformation of Gerank from his original identity as a beast clergyman of Farum Azula into Maliketh, the Black Blade bound to serve Marika as her shadow, represents the most complete example of this process of repurposing ancient loyalties for contemporary needs. This was not merely a change of employment, but a fundamental reconstruction of identity, a process that required the Beast Lord to surrender his individual agency in favor of a form of existence that was defined entirely by its relationship to another being. The binding that created this shadow relationship operated on levels that transcended simple oath-taking or contractual agreement to encompass magical and spiritual transformations that made betrayal not merely dishonest but literally impossible. The shadow became an extension of their Empyrean's will, a living tool that possessed intelligence and initiative, but which could never direct those capabilities toward purposes that conflicted with their master's interests or desires. The specific task assigned to Maliketh, the sealing and safeguarding of destined death, reveals the profound trust that Marika placed in her shadow, for this was not merely a matter of personal security, but a responsibility that affected the fundamental nature of existence itself. Destined death represented the natural law that ensured all things would eventually reach their proper endings, a force so fundamental to the cosmic order that its manipulation could alter the basic conditions under which life and consciousness operated. The transformation of death from natural law into managed resources under Maliketh's guardianship represents one of the most ambitious attempts at cosmic engineering in recorded history, an effort to create a form of existence where endings could be controlled and directed rather than simply accepted as inevitable. This transformation required not merely power but wisdom, the ability to distinguish between deaths that served the greater good and those that would disrupt the careful balance that sustained the Golden Order. The burden that this responsibility placed upon Maliketh's consciousness can scarcely be imagined, for he became the sole arbiter of one of the most fundamental forces in existence, a being whose decisions would determine not merely who lived and who died, but when and how those transitions would occur. The weight of such responsibility would have been crushing to a being of lesser devotion, but Maliketh's transformation into shadow had equipped him with forms of purpose and meaning that transcended individual psychology to encompass cosmic significance. The partial failure of Maliketh's mission, evidenced by the escape of fragments of destined death that manifested as deathroot throughout the lands between, reveals the inherent limitations of even the most carefully constructed systems of control. The force that he had been charged to contain was not merely powerful but fundamental, an aspect of reality so deeply embedded in the nature of existence that its complete suppression required constant vigilance and perfect execution, that no individual being, however devoted or capable, could maintain indefinitely. The spread of deathroot throughout the realm created a situation that tormented Maliketh's consciousness. For every manifestation of escaped death represented not merely a practical problem, but a personal failure, evidence that he had fallen short of the absolute standard that his role demanded. His desperate efforts to gather and contain these fragments, his transformation back into the Gurunk identity that could move more freely through the world in pursuit of his impossible mission, demonstrated the psychological toll that absolute responsibility could exact even upon beings whose nature had been specifically designed to bear such burdens. The tragedy of Maliketh's situation lay not in any failure of dedication or competence, but in the inherent impossibility of the task he had been assigned. Destined death was not merely a force that could be contained, but a principle that was woven into the very fabric of existence, and its complete suppression required not merely vigilance, but a fundamental restructuring of reality itself that exceeded even the capabilities of the greater will's most sophisticated servants. The legend of the first shadow that gave rise to the tradition of binding beast lords to Empyreans speaks to the deep historical roots of this practice, suggesting that the relationship between powerful beings and their designated guardians represented a pattern that had emerged from the earliest experiments in divine governance. The image of wolves bowing before a human woman that appears in the ancient art of Farum Azula may represent the first recorded instance of such a relationship, a prototype that would be refined and developed across the ages into the sophisticated system of shadows that characterized the later periods of divine rule. The wolves that were chosen to serve as shadows possessed characteristics that made them ideal for this role, combining fierce loyalty with intelligent independence, protective instincts with the capacity for complex reasoning about threats and appropriate responses. Their natural pack behavior, which emphasized cooperation and hierarchy while preserving individual initiative within established roles, provided a template for relationships that could function effectively across vast differences in power and perspective. Blade's creation specifically to serve as Rani's shadow represents the evolution of this tradition into a form that could accommodate the unique requirements of individual Empyreans, while maintaining the essential characteristics that made shadows effective guardians. Unlike the ancient beast lords, who had been repurposed from existing roles, Blade was designed from the beginning for his specific function, his nature carefully crafted to complement Rani's own capabilities and temperament, while providing the forms of protection and support that her particular path would require. The more human-like appearance that Blade possessed, in contrast to the more obviously bestial forms of earlier shadows, reflects the sophistication that had been achieved in the art of creating beings whose function was defined by service to others. The Two Fingers had learned through experience that effectiveness as a shadow required not merely loyalty and strength, but the ability to interact successfully with a wide range of beings and situations, capabilities that were enhanced by forms that could blend into diverse social environments without causing alarm or attracting unwanted attention. The internal conflict that ultimately destroyed Blade arose from the fundamental contradiction between his loyalty to Rani as an individual and his deeper programming as a servant of the Greater Will's cosmic agenda. When Rani's path diverged from the trajectory that the Greater Will had planned for her, Bled found himself torn between competing forms of devotion that could not be reconciled through any form of compromise or accommodation. This tragedy reveals the inherent limitations of creating beings whose entire existence is defined by service to others. For such relationships inevitably create situations where the servant must choose between different interpretations of what loyalty requires. The most devoted shadows become victims of their own dedication, destroyed not by external enemies, but by the internal contradictions that arise when absolute commitment encounters irreconcilable conflicts of purpose. Serosh's relationship with Godfrey represents a different model of the shadow dynamic, one based not on the binding of beast to Empyrean, but on the voluntary association between two powerful beings whose capabilities complement each other in ways that benefit both parties. Rather than being created or transformed specifically for his role, Serosh chose to ally himself with Godfrey as a means of channeling his own considerable abilities toward purposes that aligned with his understanding of cosmic order and justice. The specific function that Serosh served in tempering Godfrey's battle lust demonstrates the sophisticated understanding of psychology and behavior that characterized the most successful shadow relationships. Rather than simply suppressing or redirecting Godfrey's warrior nature, Serosh helped him learn to control and focus those impulses in ways that made them more effective tools for achieving strategic objectives, while preventing them from becoming destructive obsessions that might interfere with his broader responsibilities as Elden Lord. The ethereal nature that Serosh maintained throughout his association with Godfrey suggests that their relationship operated on spiritual and metaphysical levels that transcended simple physical presence, creating forms of influence and guidance that could persist even when conventional communication was impossible. This spiritual dimension of the shadow relationship reveals its potential for creating connections between beings that go beyond mere cooperation to encompass genuine transformation and mutual growth. The golden fur and black claws that characterized Serosh's appearance provide insight into the symbolic significance of his role, for these were not merely aesthetic choices but representations of the dual nature that all effective shadows must embody. The gold spoke to his alignment with the cosmic principles represented by the Greater Will and the Erdtree, while the black claws revealed his capacity for violence and destruction when such measures were necessary for the protection of what he served. The broader pattern that emerges from examination of these various shadow relationships reveals the Greater Will's sophisticated approach to the challenge of managing powerful beings whose capabilities might otherwise pose threats to established order, rather than attempting to suppress or eliminate such beings. The cosmic intelligence chose to channel their abilities toward constructive purposes while creating bonds of loyalty that were deeper and more enduring than mere political alliances or contractual agreements. The Beast Lords who accepted transformation into shadows found in their new roles not diminishment but fulfillment, opportunities to express their deepest nature in service of purposes that transcended individual ambition or desire. Their loyalty became a form of self-actualization, a means of achieving significance and meaning that would have been impossible through purely selfish pursuits or isolated existence. The Empyreans who received such devoted guardians gained more than mere protection, for their shadows served not only as shields against external threats but as advisors whose wisdom had been shaped by experiences that spanned multiple ages and orders. The Beast Lords brought to their new roles perspectives that had been forged in the crucible of cosmic transition, understanding of loyalty and service that had been tested by challenges that would have destroyed lesser beings. The tragic dimension of these relationships, evidenced by the internal conflicts that ultimately destroyed many shadows, serves as a reminder that even the most carefully constructed systems of loyalty and service contain within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. The very intensity that made shadows so effective as guardians also made them vulnerable to forms of psychological damage that could arise when their fundamental assumptions about purpose and meaning were challenged by circumstances that exceeded the parameters of their original programming. The evolution of shadow traditions across the ages reflects the ongoing efforts of cosmic intelligences to create stable relationships between beings of vastly different natures and capabilities. Each generation of shadows incorporated lessons learned from the successes and failures of their predecessors, resulting in increasingly sophisticated forms of binding and service that addressed previously unforeseen challenges while preserving the essential characteristics that made such relationships valuable. The ultimate lesson of the shadow tradition lies in its demonstration that loyalty and service, when freely given and properly channeled, can transcend the limitations of individual existence to create forms of meaning and purpose that endure across cosmic transitions. The Beast Lords who became shadows achieved a form of immortality, not through preservation of their individual identities, but through integration into larger patterns of significance that continued to influence events long after their personal stories had reached their conclusions. The legacy of these relationships continues to shape the expectations and possibilities that define interactions between powerful beings, providing templates for cooperation and mutual support that acknowledge both the potential benefits and inherent risks of creating bonds that transcend ordinary friendship or alliance. The shadows who served faithfully, even unto destruction, created precedents for devotion that inspire and challenge all who encounter their stories. Reminders that the highest forms of loyalty require not blind obedience, but intelligent dedication to principles that are worthy of ultimate sacrifice. In the wind-swept wastes of Caelid, where the scarlet rot has painted the landscape in hues of decay and transformation, there lies a sight that speaks to both the majesty of what once was and the tragedy of what has become. Here, surrounded by her grieving offspring, the great dragon Greyoll maintains her final vigil, her massive form, a testament to the scope of life that flourished when the world was younger and the barriers between mortal and immortal were less clearly defined. Greyoll represents something unprecedented in the long history of Draconic evolution, a being who bridges the gap between the stone-scaled ancients of prehistory and the flesh and blood dragons that would inherit a world transformed by forces beyond their understanding or control. Her size alone speaks to her significance, for she rivals even the mighty Placidusax in her dimensions, her body stretching across the landscape like a living mountain that has chosen to rest among the lesser hills and valleys of the mortal realm. Yet for all her impressive scale, Greyoll is not an ancient dragon in the truest sense, lacking the stone scales that granted their predecessors mastery over time and immunity to the ravages of mortality. She represents instead the first generation of dragons to be born into a world where such gifts were no longer available, beings who inherited the physical magnitude of their ancestors while being stripped of the temporal advantages that had made the ancient dragons truly immortal. The loss of stone scales in Greyoll's lineage marks one of the most profound transformations in the history of draconic evolution, a change so fundamental that it reshaped not only the physical capabilities of these beings, but their entire relationship with the world around them. Where the ancient dragons had existed outside the normal flow of time, secure in their immunity to age and decay, Greyoll and her descendants found themselves subject to the same mortal limitations that constrained all other forms of life. This transformation from immortal to mortal status did not occur gradually, but appears to have been a sudden shift that affected an entire generation, suggesting that it was not the result of natural evolutionary processes, but of cosmic changes that altered the fundamental conditions under which draconic life could exist. The departure of the nameless god, the collapse of the ancient order, and the emergence of new forms of divine authority all contributed to creating an environment where the old forms of dragon existence were no longer sustainable. The adaptation that allowed Greyoll's lineage to survive this cosmic transition demonstrates the remarkable resilience and flexibility that characterizes life at its most fundamental level. Deprived of their ancestors' temporal mastery, these new dragons developed the ability to absorb and incorporate characteristics from their environments, transforming what might have been a catastrophic loss into an opportunity for new forms of growth and development. The children of Greyoll spread throughout the lands, between like seeds carried by wind to distant shores, each group adapting to the specific conditions of their chosen habitats, while retaining the essential characteristics that marked them as descendants of the Great Mother. This diaspora created the diversity of dragon types that would come to characterize the post-ancient world, from the ice-breathing worms of the mountain peaks to the glintstone corrupted beasts that haunted the territories of ambitious sorcerers. The significance of Caelid as the origin point for this mortal dragon lineage extends beyond mere geography to encompass the deeper connections between place and identity that shaped the development of draconic civilization. The presence of intact Farum Azula architecture in this region, particularly the Bestial Sanctum and the Farum Great Bridge, provides compelling evidence that this was once a center of ancient dragon culture, a place where the immortal beings of prehistory maintained significant populations and important institutions. The gravel stones scattered throughout Caelid tell the story of ancient dragon presence in terms that can be read by those who understand their significance. These fragments of time-twisting scales, polished into their current form by the devoted hands of beast clergymen, represent the physical remnants of beings whose very existence had been woven into the fabric of temporal manipulation. Their presence in such quantities suggests that Caelid was not merely visited by ancient dragons, but was home to them, a place where they lived and died, and left behind traces of their impossible nature. The architectural monuments that remain in Caelid serve as bridges between the ancient world and the mortal age that followed, structures that were built not by beings who could manipulate time, but by servants who understood the principles underlying such manipulation and could incorporate them into permanent forms. The Bestial Sanctum, with its soaring spires and impossible geometries, represents the culmination of beast architectural achievement, a building that captures something of Farum Azula's temporal complexity while remaining anchored in the material world. The Dragon Barrow, that region where Greyoll now lies dying, carries within its very name the suggestion that this was always intended as a place of endings, a landscape designed to accommodate the transition from life to death that the mortal dragons would experience in ways their ancient predecessors never could. The term barrow evokes the burial mounds of ancient cultures, suggesting that this region was conceived from the beginning as a place where dragons would come to rest when their time had finally ended. The choice of Caelid as both birthplace and graveyard for the mortal dragon lineage speaks to a poetic sensibility that recognizes the appropriateness of circular journeys, the wisdom of returning to origins when the time comes for final rest. Greyoll's presence in this landscape represents not exile or abandonment, but homecoming, a return to the place where her kind first learned what it meant to be mortal, and where they could face that mortality with dignity and grace. The scarlet rot that now characterizes Caelid adds another layer of meaning to Greyoll's final vigil, for this corruption represents forces that her ancient predecessors would never have needed to confront. The rot speaks to the new vulnerabilities that mortality brought to draconic existence, the ways in which beings who had once been immune to all forms of corruption could now be touched and transformed by influences that operated according to entirely different principles than those that had governed the ancient world. Greyoll's response to the scarlet rot reveals both her limitations as a mortal being and her nobility as a creature who refuses to surrender to despair despite the magnitude of the challenges she faces. Her inability to lift herself from the ground, to take flight and escape the corruption that surrounds her, speaks to the physical constraints that mortality has placed upon even the mightiest of her kind. Yet her continued existence, her refusal to simply succumb to the rot and die, demonstrates a form of courage that transcends mere physical capability. The children who surround Greyoll in her final hours provide testimony to the bonds that unite dragon families across the barriers of species and circumstance. These lesser dragons, themselves products of the environmental adaptations that characterize their lineage, have chosen to remain with their mother rather than flee to safer territories, demonstrating forms of loyalty and devotion that echo the ancient traditions of draconic service and commitment. The roars that Greyoll produces in her weakened state serve multiple purposes, functioning simultaneously as calls to her scattered offspring, expressions of her own pain and defiance, and declarations to the world that she continues to exist despite all the forces arrayed against her. These vocalizations represent one of the few powers that remain fully available to her, sounds that can travel across vast distances to reach dragons who might otherwise remain unaware of their mother's plight. The response of her children to these calls reveals the extent of Greyoll's influence and the depth of the connections that bind the mortal dragon lineage together. Dragons scattered across the breadth of the lands, between pause in their activities when they hear their mother's voice, turning towards Caelid with expressions of concern and longing that speak to bonds that transcend physical distance and individual circumstance. The relationship between Greyoll and her descendants represents a new form of draconic social organization, one based not on the hierarchical structures that characterized ancient dragon civilization, but on familial bonds that emphasize emotional connection and mutual support. This transformation reflects the broader changes that mortality brought to draconic existence, the ways in which beings who could no longer rely on individual immortality learned to find meaning and continuity through relationships that extended beyond personal boundaries. The diversity of dragon types that emerged from Greyoll's lineage demonstrates the remarkable adaptability that mortality paradoxically brought to draconic evolution. Where the ancient dragons had achieved perfection through their stone scales and temporal mastery, creating forms that were stable but essentially unchanging, the mortal dragons developed the capacity for rapid adaptation that allowed them to thrive in environments that would have been impossible for their predecessors to inhabit. The ice dragons that claim the mountain peaks as their territory represent the first major branch of this evolutionary diversification, creatures who learn to transform the hostile conditions of high altitude and extreme cold into sources of power and identity. Their breath weapons, which produced freezing effects rather than the traditional flames associated with draconic combat, marked them as beings who had successfully integrated environmental characteristics into their essential nature. The process by which these environmental adaptations occurred appears to have been both rapid and comprehensive, suggesting that the loss of stone scales created opportunities for forms of change that had been impossible while those temporal anchors remained in place. The mortal dragons discovered that their flesh and blood bodies could incorporate characteristics from their surroundings in ways that their stone-scaled ancestors never could, creating new possibilities for growth and specialization that compensated for the loss of immortal status. The glintstone dragons represent perhaps the most dramatic example of this adaptive capacity, creatures who transformed their diet of magical scholars into fundamental changes in their nature and abilities. The consumption of sorcerers and their magical implements gradually altered these dragons' breath weapons from traditional flame to crystalline projections that reflected their integration of glintstone magic into their biological processes. The tragic dimension of these adaptations lies in their irrevocability, for the dragons who underwent such transformations found themselves committed to their chosen paths in ways that precluded return to more generalized forms of existence. The ice dragons could not survive in warmer climates. The glintstone dragons required continued access to magical prey, and all of them discovered that their environmental specializations brought both new capabilities and new vulnerabilities. The hearts of these mortal dragons, revealed to contain fragments of the gravel stones that had once formed their ancestors' immortal scales, provide the most poignant evidence of the continuities that connected the ancient and modern forms of draconic existence. These organs, still beating with life even after their owners' deaths, represented the concentration of whatever immortal essence remained available to beings who had been born into an age when such gifts were no longer freely distributed. The irony that mortal dragon hearts contained the very materials that had once granted immortality to their predecessors speaks to the cruel mathematics of cosmic transition, the ways in which the resources that had once been abundant enough to armor entire beings became so scarce that they could only survive in the most protected and essential organs. The hearts became repositories of ancient power, vessels that preserved fragments of prehistory within the bodies of creatures who would never fully understand what they carried. The discovery of these gravel stone fragments within dragon hearts created opportunities for those brave or foolish enough to consume them, mortals who sought to acquire draconic characteristics through the most direct means possible. The practice of dragon communion that emerged from this discovery represented a new form of the ancient relationship between dragons and other species, one based not on service and worship, but on consumption and transformation. The communities that developed around dragon communion altars, built over the bodies of ancient dragons whose stone flesh provided appropriate ceremonial settings, created new forms of religious practice that combined reverence for draconic power with practical techniques for acquiring that power through ritual consumption. These sites became focal points for individuals who sought to transcend human limitations through incorporation of draconic essence, regardless of the costs such transformations might exact. The geographical distribution of these communion sites throughout the lands between reflects the extent to which Greyoll's children had spread in their diaspora from Caelid, for each altar marked a location where dragons had lived and died, leaving behind the physical remains that could serve as appropriate settings for the communion rituals. The network of these sites created a map of draconic influence that extended far beyond the boundaries of their ancestral homeland. Greyoll's current state weakened by rot, but still maintaining her vigil over the landscape that had witnessed both the birth and decline of her lineage, represents the culmination of a story that spans the transition from immortal to mortal existence. Her massive form serves as both monument and warning, a reminder of the majesty that dragons once possessed and the vulnerabilities that mortality has introduced into their existence. The inevitability of her eventual death, hastened by the corruption that surrounds her, but ultimately rooted in the mortal nature that defines her existence, marks a transition point in the history of Draconic civilization. When Greyoll finally succumbs to the forces that have been slowly consuming her, the world will lose not merely an individual dragon, but the living link to the age when dragons first learned to be mortal, the bridge between ancient immortality and contemporary vulnerability. Yet even in her dying, Greyoll continues to fulfill her role as mother to her scattered children, her presence providing them with a point of reference and identity that transcends individual circumstance. Her roars continue to call them home. Her massive form continues to anchor their understanding of what it means to be a dragon, in an age when such identity must be constantly renegotiated in the face of changing circumstances and new challenges. As the children of Greyoll spread throughout the lands between in their great diaspora from the dragon barrow of Caelid, they carried with them not only the legacy of their mighty mother, but also the remarkable gift of adaptation that had replaced the stone scales of their immortal predecessors. This ability to absorb and incorporate characteristics from their chosen environments would prove to be both blessing and curse, granting them new forms of power, while binding them irrevocably to the territories they came to inhabit. The first and perhaps most successful of these adaptations occurred among the dragons who sought the highest peaks of the mountaintops of the giants, those windswept summits where the air grew thin and the cold bit with teeth sharper than any blade. Here, in landscapes that seemed to touch the very heavens from which their ancient forebears had once ruled, these dragons underwent transformations that would forever mark them as beings of ice and storm rather than fire and fury. The ice dragons who claimed these elevated territories were not merely seeking refuge from the changing world below, but were drawn by instincts that spoke to deeper connections between their nature and the cosmic forces that had once elevated their kind to positions of divine authority. The mountaintops, according to ancient lore, nearly touched the sky itself, bringing their inhabitants as close as earthbound beings could come to the celestial realms where the greater will exercised its influence over the material world. Borealis, whose very name has become synonymous with the freezing fog that characterizes his domain, represents the culmination of this icy adaptation, a being whose breath weapons produce not the traditional flames associated with draconic combat, but crystalline mists that can freeze the very air itself. His mastery over these frigid forces speaks to evolutionary changes so profound that they altered the fundamental nature of draconic biology, replacing the fire-producing organs of his ancestors with mechanisms capable of generating temperatures that could preserve or destroy with equal effectiveness. The territorial behavior that led these ice dragons to claim dominion over the mountainous regions brought them into inevitable conflict with the fire giants who had long considered these peaks their ancestral homeland. This confrontation between beings of opposing elemental natures created some of the most spectacular battles in the recorded history of the lands between, conflicts where the fundamental forces of heat and cold clashed with intensities that could reshape entire landscapes. The eventual defeat of the ice dragons by the fire giants speaks not to any inherent weakness in the adapted dragons, but to the advantages that came with established territorial control and deep familiarity with the challenging conditions of high-altitude existence. The fire giants had learned over countless generations how to thrive in environments where lesser beings would perish from cold and oxygen deprivation, and their mastery of flame provided them with weapons perfectly suited to countering the ice-based attacks of their draconic challengers. The exile of the ice dragons from the peaks they had sought to claim marked the beginning of a pattern that would characterize many of their environmental adaptations. For the very specializations that granted them new capabilities also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood the nature of their transformations. The dragons who had learned to breathe freezing mist found themselves at severe disadvantages when confronted by opponents wielding fire, their adapted biology becoming a source of weakness rather than strength. The relationship between the ice dragons and the astrologers who also sought the mountain peaks reveals the complex web of alliances and conflicts that characterized the early history of the lands between. These human scholars, drawn to elevated locations by their desire to study celestial movements and cosmic influences, found themselves sharing territory with dragons whose own motivations were not entirely dissimilar, for both groups sought proximity to the heavens as a means of understanding and accessing powers that transcended earthbound limitations. The connection between the astrologers and the eventual Carrion royal family, evidenced by artifacts that bear the markings of both groups, suggests that the relationships formed in these mountainous regions would have lasting consequences for the development of magical traditions throughout the realm. The oath-sworn dragons that would later serve Renala and her daughter Rani may have had their origins in alliances forged during these early encounters between human scholars and displaced ice dragons. The practice of oath-swearing that emerged from these relationships represents a fascinating evolution of the ancient traditions of draconic service, adapted to accommodate the realities of a world where dragons were no longer the undisputed masters of their domains. Rather than demanding submission from other species, the mortal dragons learned to negotiate partnerships based on mutual benefit and shared interests, creating bonds that honored the dignity of both parties while recognizing the practical advantages that could be gained through cooperation. Azula, whose service to Rani would eventually become one of the most celebrated examples of dragon loyalty in the modern age, exemplifies the nobility that could emerge from these oath-sworn relationships. Her devotion to her chosen mistress went beyond mere contractual obligation to encompass genuine affection and respect, demonstrating that the capacity for love and loyalty that had characterized the ancient dragons had been successfully transmitted to their mortal descendants. The development of cold sorceries among the human populations of the mountain regions represents one of the most significant examples of knowledge transfer between species, for these magical techniques appear to have been derived from observation and interaction with the ice dragons who had mastered such forces through biological adaptation. The Zamor warriors, those fierce defenders who would eventually drive the fire giants from their ancestral peaks, wielded ice-based combat techniques that bore unmistakable resemblances to the breath weapons of their draconic neighbors. The transmission of these cold sorceries from the Zamor to the Snow Witch, and from her to Rani herself, creates a chain of knowledge that connects the earliest environmental adaptations of Greyoll's children to some of the most sophisticated magical practices of the current age. This lineage demonstrates how the innovations born from necessity in one generation can become the foundations for entirely new traditions of power and understanding in subsequent ones. The glintstone dragons represent perhaps the most dramatic example of adaptation through consumption, creatures whose dietary preferences fundamentally altered their nature in ways that their ice-breathing cousins could never have imagined. These dragons, drawn to the territories where human sorcerers practiced their arts, discovered that the consumption of magical practitioners and their crystalline implements could grant them access to forms of power that had previously been beyond their reach. Smaragd, whose corruption through glintstone consumption transformed his breath from traditional flame to crystalline projectiles, demonstrates both the potential and the perils of this form of adaptation. His acquisition of magical capabilities came at the cost of his original draconic nature, creating a hybrid being that possessed neither the full power of an ancient dragon nor the complete mastery of a human sorcerer, but rather an unstable combination that satisfied neither tradition. The transformation that resulted from glintstone consumption appears to have been irreversible, binding these dragons to patterns of behavior and dietary requirements that removed much of their freedom to choose their own paths. The need to continue consuming sorcerers and their magical implements created a cycle of predation that inevitably brought these dragons into conflict with the very communities whose knowledge had granted them their new abilities. The relationship between Renala and her oath-sworn dragon reveals the complexity that could emerge when these consumptive patterns intersected with political and personal alliances. The dragon who served the queen of Raya Lucaria had presumably gained its loyalty through defeat in battle rather than through the consumption of her subjects, creating a relationship based on respect rather than predation, honor rather than hunger. The magical traditions that developed around these human-dragon interactions demonstrate the bidirectional nature of knowledge transfer in the post-ancient world, for while dragons learned new forms of power from their consumption of human sorcerers, the human communities also gained insights into the nature of draconic abilities that informed their own development of magical techniques. The result was a cross-pollination of traditions that enriched both species while creating new forms of hybrid practice that had never before existed. The tragic dimension of glintstone corruption becomes most apparent in the fate of dragons like Smaragd, whose pursuit of magical power ultimately trapped them in patterns of existence that stripped away much of what had made them truly draconic. Their crystalline breath weapons, while impressive in their destructive potential, lacked the fundamental fire that had connected their ancestors to the cosmic forces that had once elevated dragonkind to positions of divine authority. The environmental adaptations that characterized Greyoll's children extended beyond the dramatic examples of ice and glintstone corruption to encompass subtler but equally significant transformations that allowed dragons to thrive in diverse ecological niches throughout the lands between. These adaptations demonstrate the remarkable flexibility that mortality had paradoxically granted to draconic evolution, creating opportunities for specialization that had been impossible during the age of stone-scaled immortality. The process by which these environmental characteristics were absorbed and integrated into draconic biology appears to have operated according to principles that transcended simple dietary consumption to encompass more fundamental forms of interaction between organism and environment. Dragons who spent extended periods in particular territories gradually acquired characteristics that reflected the essential nature of those places, their bodies becoming living expressions of the landscapes they inhabited. This form of adaptation required not merely physical presence, but deep integration with local ecosystems, a willingness to become part of the environments they sought to master rather than remaining separate from them. The dragons who achieved the most successful adaptations were those who learned to think of themselves not as conquerors of their chosen territories, but as participants in larger systems of interaction and mutual influence. The diversity of dragon types that emerged from these adaptive processes created a rich tapestry of draconic existence that reflected the full range of environments available within the lands between. From the frost-breathing worms of the highest peaks to the poison-resistant beasts that learned to thrive in the most corrupted landscapes, each type represented a unique solution to the challenges of survival in a world that no longer automatically granted dragons the advantages their ancestors had enjoyed. The loss of red lightning mastery among these adapted dragons marks one of the most significant differences between the ancient and modern forms of draconic existence, for this celestial force had been the signature weapon of their stone-scaled predecessors, the visible symbol of their connection to cosmic authorities that transcended earthbound limitations. The inability of mortal dragons to wield such power speaks to the profound nature of the changes that separated them from their immortal heritage. The red lightning that had once crackled between the claws and fangs of ancient dragons represented more than mere electrical discharge, but served as a direct manifestation of divine favor, a visible reminder that these beings operated according to principles that existed beyond the reach of ordinary natural law. Its loss among their descendants marked not merely a reduction in combat effectiveness, but a fundamental disconnection from the cosmic sources of power that had once defined draconic identity. The environmental weapons that replaced red lightning in the arsenal of modern dragons, freezing mists, crystalline projections, venomous exhalations, and other specialized breath attacks, while impressive in their own right, lacked the transcendent quality that had made their ancient predecessors truly awe-inspiring. These new abilities were powerful but earthbound, reflecting mastery over natural forces rather than command of cosmic principles. The geographical distribution of different dragon types throughout the lands between creates a living map of adaptation and specialization that tells the story of how Greyoll's children learned to survive and thrive in a world that no longer offered them the automatic advantages of immortality. Each region that supports a distinct dragon population represents a successful experiment in environmental integration, a demonstration that draconic flexibility could compensate for the loss of temporal mastery. The ice dragons of the mountainous regions, the glintstone corrupted beasts of the magical academies, the rot-resistant dragons of the most blighted territories, and the fire-breathing worms of the central regions each represent different strategies for survival and success in the post-ancient world. Their collective diversity demonstrates that the loss of stone scales, while traumatic in its initial impact, ultimately opened new possibilities for draconic evolution that had been foreclosed by the perfection of their immortal predecessors. The ongoing evolution of these dragon populations suggests that the adaptive processes that began with Greyoll's children continue to operate, creating opportunities for further specialization and development that may eventually produce dragon types whose capabilities exceed even those of their ancient ancestors in specific domains. While they may never regain the temporal mastery that once set dragonkind apart from all other forms of life, their environmental adaptations grant them forms of power and resilience that are uniquely suited to the challenges of existence in the contemporary world. The relationships that these adapted dragons form with other species reflect the more collaborative approach to existence that mortality has encouraged among their kind. Where the ancient dragons had commanded through divine authority and temporal superiority, the modern dragons must negotiate their place in a world populated by beings whose capabilities often complement or even exceed their own in specific areas. These collaborative relationships, while representing a diminishment of the absolute authority that dragons once enjoyed, have also created opportunities for forms of mutual enrichment and cooperative achievement that were impossible during the age of draconic supremacy. The oath-sworn dragons who serve human masters, the dragons who learn from magical practitioners, and the dragons who adapt to serve specific environmental functions all demonstrate that cooperation can be as effective as domination in achieving lasting success and significance. In the shadowed corners of the lands between, where ancient altars stand beneath the skeletal remains of beings who once commanded the very flow of time itself, there exists a practice so profound in its implications and terrible in its consequences that it represents perhaps the darkest intersection between human ambition and draconic legacy. This is the ritual known as Dragon Communion, a ceremony of consumption and transformation that promises to bridge the vast gulf between mortal limitation and draconic power, yet which delivers only corruption and madness to those who dare to partake of its forbidden offerings. The altars where these rituals take place were not built by those who would later use them for such purposes, but were constructed as monuments to the ancient dragons whose massive forms provide the ceremonial settings for these acts of desperate transformation. These stone platforms, raised beneath the ribcages and skulls of beings whose existence had once transcended the boundaries of mortality, serve as grim reminders of the magnitude of power that the communion seekers hope to acquire through their consumption of draconic essence. The irony embedded within these ceremonial sites speaks to the fundamental misunderstanding that drives the practice of dragon communion. For those who seek to become dragons through the consumption of their hearts, fail to recognize that the ancient dragons whose remains shelter their rituals achieved their greatness through principles that stood in direct opposition to the predatory consumption that characterizes the communion process. Where the ancient dragons had been elevated through service and synthesis, the communion practitioners sought elevation through domination and absorption. The hearts that serve as the focus of these rituals carry within their still-beating chambers fragments of the gravel stones that had once formed the immortal scales of the ancient dragons, creating a tragic connection between the mortal descendants of Greyoll's lineage and the prehistoric beings whose power they had inherited in such diminished form. These organs, continuing to pulse with life even after the deaths of their owners, represent the concentration of whatever draconic essence remains accessible in an age when such power has become scarce beyond measure. The process of harvesting these hearts requires not merely the killing of dragons, but a form of ritualized butchery that strips away any pretense of honor or respect that might otherwise characterize the relationship between hunter and prey. The communion practitioners approach their draconic targets not as worthy opponents to be faced in honorable combat, but as sources of raw material to be processed for consumption, reducing magnificent beings to mere components in a recipe for personal transformation. The living nature of the harvested hearts, evidenced by their continued beating, long after separation from their owners' bodies, adds a dimension of horror to the communion process that speaks to the fundamental violation of natural law that the ritual represents. These organs, infused with the life force and accumulated experiences of beings whose existence had spanned decades or centuries, retain their vitality through connections to sources of power that transcend ordinary biological processes. The consumption of these still-living hearts in the shadow of ancient dragon remains creates a ceremony that combines elements of sacrifice, cannibalism, and blasphemy into a single act of desperate transformation. The communion practitioners, kneeling before altars built from the bones of beings they could never hope to equal, consume the essence of their descendants while surrounded by reminders of the greatness they seek to achieve through such degraded means. The Dragon Communion Seal, crafted from the blood of consumed dragons and shaped by forces that operate beyond ordinary understanding, serves as both tool and symbol of the practice that creates it. This formless implement, lacking the fixed shape that characterizes conventional magical focuses, represents the fluid and unstable nature of power that has been acquired through consumption rather than earned through service or study. The seal's ability to enhance draconic incantations while simultaneously marking its user as one who has partaken in the degraded practice of communion creates a visible reminder of the moral compromises that such power requires. Those who wield these blood-forged implements announce to all who recognize their significance that they have chosen the path of predation over the path of partnership, consumption over cooperation. The incantations that can be learned through dragon communion represent corrupted versions of the powers that the ancient dragons once wielded with nobility and purpose, techniques that have been stripped of their original context and meaning to become mere tools for personal advancement. The red lightning that crackles from the weapons of communion practitioners lacks the divine authority that had characterized the same force when wielded by the stone-scaled ancients, becoming instead a hollow imitation that possesses destructive capability without transcendent significance. The transformation that gradually overtakes those who persist in the practice of dragon communion follows a predictable pattern that reflects the fundamental incompatibility between human nature and the draconic essence they seek to absorb. The initial changes are often subtle, manifesting as alterations in eye color and pupil shape that mark the beginning of a process that will eventually consume every aspect of their humanity. The yellow, slitted eyes that appear in the early stages of communion corruption serve as windows into souls that are being slowly overwritten by influences they cannot comprehend or control. These ocular changes represent more than mere physical transformation, but mark the beginning of alterations in perception and consciousness that will gradually isolate the affected individuals from their human origins and social connections. The progression from these initial changes to the complete loss of human form follows a trajectory that reflects the accumulated weight of draconic essence consumed, and the individual's capacity to resist the transformative forces that such consumption unleashes. Some practitioners experience rapid and dramatic changes that strip away their humanity within months of beginning their communion practices, while others maintain their human appearance for years before succumbing to the inevitable alterations. The magma worm form that represents the ultimate destination of the communion transformation process creates beings that possess neither the majesty of true dragons nor the dignity of their original human nature, but rather exist as grotesque parodies that combine the worst aspects of both species. These land-bound creatures, deprived of the ability to fly and cursed with forms that inspire revulsion rather than awe, represent the failure of human ambition to transcend its natural limitations through artificial means. Theodorix, whose transformation from troll hero to magma worm demonstrates that the corruption of dragon communion extends beyond human practitioners to affect other species as well, provides insight into the universal nature of the forces that the ritual unleashes. His participation in the war against the giants as a loyal servant of the Golden Order, followed by his eventual corruption through communion practices, illustrates the tragic irony that those who seek draconic power often lose the very qualities that had made them worthy of such power in the first place. The enhanced resilience that Theodorix's troll heritage provided him in his transformed state suggests that different species may experience varying degrees of resistance to the communion corruption, but ultimately proves that no form of natural toughness can provide complete protection against the fundamental incompatibility between mortal consciousness and draconic essence. His survival in magma worm form, while impressive compared to human transformations, still represents a complete loss of his original identity and purpose. The Cave of the Forlorn, where Theodorix maintains his guard over treasures that he no longer possesses the cognitive capacity to truly understand or appreciate, serves as a monument to the futility of seeking transcendence through consumption. The legendary armament he protects represents power that was achieved through legitimate means, creating a cruel contrast with his own corrupted state, and serving as a reminder of the paths not taken. The presence of a fire-breathing dragon's corpse within the cave provides additional evidence for the theory that Caelid served as a migration route for Greyoll's children as they spread throughout the lands between, but also adds another layer of tragic irony to Theodorix's story. Here was a being who had consumed dragon hearts in hopes of achieving draconic transformation, standing guard over the remains of a creature who had achieved such transformation through natural birth and development. The dragon hunters who pursue communion practices represent perhaps the most psychologically complex participants in this degraded ritual, for they combine genuine appreciation for draconic power with the predatory instincts necessary to acquire it through violent means. These individuals often possess sufficient knowledge of dragon behavior and capabilities to recognize the magnitude of what they are destroying, yet persist in their hunting activities, because their desire for personal transformation overrides their respect for their targets. Ura, whose background as a former dragon hunter provides him with intimate knowledge of both the appeal and the dangers of communion practices, serves as a voice of warning for those who might be tempted to follow similar paths. His personal experience with the hunting lifestyle allows him to speak with authority about the psychological seductions that draw individuals toward communion, while his subsequent rejection of such practices demonstrates that escape from this cycle of predation remains possible for those with sufficient moral clarity. The relationship between Ura and Eleonora illustrates the personal tragedies that communion practices create within communities of dragon hunters, transforming partnerships based on mutual respect and shared goals into conflicts between those who have succumbed to corruption and those who resist it. The intimate knowledge that former allies possess of each other's techniques and vulnerabilities makes these confrontations particularly painful and difficult to resolve through conventional combat. Eleonora's status as a Drake Knight, marked by armor crafted from dragon wing membranes and weapons that channel draconic power, represents an attempt to achieve some of the benefits of communion, while maintaining a greater degree of respect for the dragons whose materials are incorporated into her equipment. However, even this more restrained approach to draconic enhancement ultimately leads toward the same corruption that affects direct communion practitioners, suggesting that any form of power acquired through dragon exploitation carries inherent risks of transformation and loss of humanity. The reverence that Drake Knights profess for their draconic targets creates a complex moral landscape where genuine appreciation for dragon magnificence coexists with predatory behavior that ultimately destroys what it claims to honor. This contradiction reveals one of the fundamental psychological mechanisms that allows communion practitioners to persist in their activities despite clear evidence of the harm they cause to both their targets and themselves. The yellow-eyed transformation that marks advanced stages of communion corruption affects Drake Knights as surely as it affects direct heart consumers, demonstrating that the source of draconic essence matters less than the fundamental act of appropriation without consent. The power that flows through dragon material armor and weapons carries with it the same corruptive influences that affect those who consume dragon hearts directly. The Dragon Communion Revenger, known as Exikes, embodies the natural response that draconic consciousness might be expected to have toward the predatory practices that have emerged around the communion altars. This scarlet rot-corrupted dragon has positioned himself as a guardian of one such altar, not to facilitate communion practices, but to prevent them through the application of overwhelming force against would-be practitioners. The scarlet rot that has claimed Exikes as its host adds a dimension of tragic irony to his role as communion preventer, for his corruption by this external force mirrors the corruption that communion practitioners voluntarily inflict upon themselves through their consumption of draconic essence. Both represent forms of transformation that strip away original identity in service of alien influences, yet Exikes maintains his essential draconic nature while communion practitioners lose their essential humanity. The hatred that drives Exikes to continue his vigilant guard over the communion altar despite the obvious toll that his corruption is exacting upon his physical form demonstrates the depth of emotion that dragons are capable of experiencing when confronted with violations of their essential nature and dignity. His persistence in this role reveals that even corruption cannot entirely eliminate the noble qualities that characterize Draconic consciousness. At its best, the geographical distribution of dragon communion altars throughout the lands between creates a network of corruption sites that reflects both the historical spread of Greyoll's children and the contemporary reach of human ambition in its most degraded forms. Each altar represents not merely a location where communion rituals take place, but a monument to the failure of one approach to transcending mortal limitations. The practitioners who gather at these sites form communities bound together by shared corruption rather than shared values, groups whose unity derives from their common descent into transformation rather than their commitment to meaningful principles. These communities often display the social dynamics of addiction, with members encouraging each other's destructive practices while rationalizing the obvious harms that result from their activities. The inevitability that characterizes the communion transformation process serves as a reminder that certain forms of power cannot be acquired without fundamental changes that may be irreversible once initiated. The practitioners who begin consuming dragon hearts with the intention of gaining only modest enhancements invariably discover that the forces they have unleashed within themselves operate according to their own logic rather than human intentions or limitations. The warnings that figures like Yura provide to potential communion practitioners often fall upon deaf ears because those who are drawn to such practices are typically motivated by forms of desperation or ambition that make rational consideration of long-term consequences difficult or impossible. The promise of immediate access to draconic power proves more compelling than abstract warnings about eventual transformation and loss of humanity. The tragedy of dragon communion extends beyond the individual practitioners who suffer corruption to encompass the broader damage that the practice inflicts upon the relationship between humans and dragons throughout the lands between. The predatory approach that communion requires creates an atmosphere of hostility and suspicion that makes the development of respectful partnerships, like those achieved by oath-sworn dragons, increasingly difficult to establish. The reduction of magnificent beings to sources of consumable materials represents a form of spiritual impoverishment that affects not only those who directly participate in communion practices, but the entire cultural context within which such practices occur. The normalization of predatory relationships with dragons creates precedents that influence how other species and magical phenomena are approached, promoting exploitation over cooperation as the default mode of interaction with sources of power that exceed human capabilities. The ultimate lesson of dragon communion lies in its demonstration that the most direct paths to desired transformations are often the most destructive, creating changes that bear little resemblance to the outcomes that motivated the initial pursuit. Those who seek to become dragons through consumption discover that they have achieved only a hollow parody of their intended transformation, gaining power while losing the very qualities that might have made such power meaningful or worthwhile. In the annals of recorded history, few events have shaken the foundations of established power as dramatically as the Great Assault that brought the ancient dragons of Farum Azula into direct conflict with the golden capital of Leyndell. This was not merely another territorial dispute between competing powers, but a collision between two entirely different eras of cosmic authority, a confrontation that would determine whether the ancient order of stone-scaled immortals could reclaim their position in a world that had moved beyond their understanding or whether the new dispensation represented by the Erdtree would prove capable of defending itself against challenges rooted in prehistoric authority. The motivations that drove the ancient dragons to abandon their crumbling city in the storm-racked heights and descend upon the golden capital remain shrouded in mystery, for the surviving records speak more to the dramatic nature of the conflict than to the complex political and spiritual considerations that may have precipitated such desperate action. What seems certain is that this was not a decision made lightly or in haste, but represented the culmination of deliberations that may have spanned decades or centuries among beings whose perspective on time differed fundamentally from that of the mortals they would eventually confront. The assembly of draconic forces that gathered for this unprecedented military action included some of the most formidable beings that had survived from the prehistoric age, creatures whose individual power exceeded that of entire armies, yet who chose to coordinate their efforts in recognition of the magnitude of the challenge they faced. These were not the diminished descendants of Greyoll's lineage, but authentic representatives of the ancient order, beings who retained the stone scales and temporal mastery that had once made their kind the undisputed masters of all existence. Fortissax, whose massive form would become a permanent fixture in Leyndell's skyline following his death in the assault, represented the pinnacle of ancient dragon physical development, a being whose size exceeded even that of Placidusax himself, and whose combat capabilities had been enhanced by the integration of artificial weapons that supplemented his natural armaments. The great bolt that served as both spear and symbol of his power demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of warfare that characterized the ancient dragon's approach to the challenge of conquering a fortified city. The decision to equip Fortissax with artificial weapons rather than relying solely on his natural capabilities reveals the careful planning that had gone into the assault, for the ancient dragons understood that their traditional advantages in size and temporal manipulation might prove insufficient against the defensive innovations that the Golden Capital had developed during its rise to prominence. The bolt of Fortissax represented not merely a weapon, but a philosophical statement, a declaration that the ancient dragons were prepared to adapt their methods to match the changing nature of warfare in the contemporary world. Fortissax, whose mastery of red lightning had been refined through centuries of practice and meditation, brought to the assault capabilities that complemented Fortissax's physical dominance with supernatural forces that could strike at ranges and with precision that conventional weapons could not match. Her glaive, charged with the fundamental energies that had once defined divine authority, served as a conduit for powers that transcended ordinary understanding of electrical phenomena to encompass direct manipulation of cosmic forces. The red lightning that Fortissax wielded retained the divine authority that had characterized such forces during the age of ancient dragon supremacy, marking her attacks not merely as expressions of personal power, but as manifestations of principles that predated the current cosmic order. Her participation in the assault represented continuity with the deepest traditions of draconic warfare, techniques that had been developed when dragons served as direct agents of cosmic authority rather than independent actors pursuing their own agendas. Fortissax, the mightiest of the boulder stones, embodied the perfect synthesis of offensive capability and defensive resilience that had made the ancient dragons such formidable opponents during their age of supremacy. His twin pillars of red lightning, capable of striking multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining full power in each attack, demonstrated the level of martial sophistication that characterized the greatest representatives of his kind. The coordination that these three mighty beings achieved during their assault on Leyndell speaks to forms of communication and tactical planning that operated on levels far beyond anything that mortal military commanders could comprehend. or replicate. Their attacks were synchronized not merely in terms of timing, but in terms of the fundamental energies they deployed, creating synergistic effects that amplified the individual contributions of each participant, while maintaining the flexibility necessary to respond to changing battlefield conditions. The walls of Leyndell, which had never before been breached by any hostile force, represented the culmination of architectural and magical defensive techniques that had been developed specifically to protect the seat of divine authority from challenges that might arise from terrestrial or celestial sources. These fortifications incorporated not merely physical barriers, but spiritual protections that were designed to repel attacks that operated according to principles beyond conventional warfare. The successful breach of these supposedly impregnable defenses marked a watershed moment in the history of military engineering, demonstrating that no defensive system, however sophisticated or divinely blessed, could provide absolute protection against attackers who possessed sufficient power and determination. The ancient dragon's success in penetrating Leyndell's outer perimeter sent shockwaves throughout the Golden Order that extended far beyond the immediate military implications of their achievement. The calamity that Grandsax rained down upon the royal capital from his position within the breached walls created scenes of destruction that had no precedent in the recorded history of the Golden Age, for this was devastation inflicted not by mortal weapons or conventional magical attacks, but by forces that operated according to the temporal and spatial principles that had once governed cosmic order itself. The very stones of the capital's buildings were twisted and shattered by energies that existed partially outside normal three-dimensional space. The psychological impact of witnessing such destruction may have been even more significant than its physical effect, for the citizens of Leyndell had lived their entire lives under the assumption that their city's divine protection rendered it invulnerable to any conceivable attack. The sight of ancient dragons moving freely through streets that had been considered absolutely secure challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine authority and the reliability of the protection it provided. The response of Leyndell's defenders to this unprecedented crisis reveals both the strengths and limitations of military institutions that had been developed primarily to maintain internal order rather than to repel external invasion. The Golden Capital's forces had been optimized for ceremonial functions and police actions against relatively minor threats, leaving them poorly prepared to confront opponents whose capabilities exceeded anything in their training or experience. Godwin the Golden, whose intervention would prove decisive in determining the outcome of the conflict, represented a new generation of divine authority that combined the inherited legitimacy of the Golden lineage with practical combat experience that had been gained through conflicts that tested both personal courage and tactical acumen. His decision to personally confront Fortissax, the mightiest of the attacking dragons, demonstrated both supreme confidence in his own abilities and sophisticated understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. The single combat between Godwin and Fortissax that determined the fate of the assault represents one of the most remarkable encounters in recorded military history. A confrontation between representatives of two different cosmic orders that was resolved not through overwhelming application of force, but through a demonstration of qualities that transcended mere combat effectiveness. The battle tested not only their respective capabilities as warriors, but their deeper understanding of honor, courage, and the principles that give meaning to conflict itself. The outcome of this combat, with Fortissax's defeat but not destruction, created an opportunity for a resolution that neither participant could have anticipated when the conflict began. Rather than following conventional practice by executing his defeated opponent or demanding surrender terms that would have humiliated the ancient dragon, Godwin chose a course of action that revealed both wisdom and magnanimity that exceeded what might have been expected from someone of his youth and position. The friendship that emerged from this combat represents one of the most extraordinary diplomatic achievements in the recorded history of interspecies relations, demonstrating that even the most fundamental conflicts of interest and worldview can sometimes be transcended through personal bonds that recognize shared virtues and common ground. The relationship that developed between Godwin and Fortissax became a model for possibilities that had previously seemed impossible to achieve. The decision to spare Fortissax and welcome him as an ally, rather than destroying him as a defeated enemy, required Godwin to take personal responsibility for the consequences of this unprecedented act of clemency. The prince was essentially gambling his own reputation and the security of his realm on his ability to judge the character of a being whose nature and motivations were fundamentally alien to anything in his previous experience. The transformation of the conflict from military assault to diplomatic opportunity created conditions that allowed for a broader resolution that extended far beyond the immediate question of Lanedel's security to encompass the future. Relationship between the ancient dragons and the Golden Order. The other ancient dragons who had participated in the assault found themselves presented with choices that they had never expected to face, options that challenged their assumptions about the inevitable nature of conflict between old and new forms of authority. The ancient dragon cult that emerged from this resolution represents one of the most successful examples of religious syncretism in recorded history, demonstrating that apparently incompatible belief systems can sometimes be integrated into coherent frameworks that honor both traditions while creating new possibilities for spiritual development. The cult provided a mechanism for preserving ancient dragon traditions within the structure of the Golden Order while allowing both to evolve in response to their interaction. The Draconic tree sentinels, who became the visible symbols of this integration, embodied the practical consequences of the philosophical synthesis that the cult represented, combining the traditional loyalty and protective instincts of the Golden Order's defenders with enhanced capabilities derived from their association with ancient dragon power and wisdom. These hybrid warriors demonstrated that cooperation between different traditions could produce results that exceeded what either could achieve independently. The weapons and armor that the Draconic tree sentinels developed from dragon claws and scales provided tangible evidence that the relationship between the ancient dragons and the Golden Order had moved beyond mere political alliance to encompass genuine sharing of resources and knowledge. These artifacts represented not exploitation of defeated enemies, but gifts freely given by allies who recognized the value of mutual support and cooperation. The color symbolism that connected the golden scales of the ancient dragons to the golden light of the Erdtree provided theological justification for the integration of draconic traditions into the existing religious framework of the Golden Order. This connection suggested that the apparent conflict between ancient and contemporary forms of divine authority was not fundamental opposition but temporary misunderstanding that could be resolved through deeper recognition of shared origins and purposes. The geographical spread of dragon cult influence throughout the territories controlled by the Golden Order demonstrates the appeal that this syncretic tradition held for populations who had been seeking spiritual alternatives that could accommodate both reverence for established authority and recognition of the power and wisdom represented by the ancient dragons. The cult provided a framework for religious expression that was both familiar and exotic, traditional and innovative. The prayer books, incantations, and ritual implements associated with the dragon cult reveal the sophisticated theological work that was required to create meaningful integration between traditions that had originated in vastly different cosmic and historical contexts. The scholars and priests who developed these materials had to solve complex problems of translation and interpretation that required deep understanding of both systems of belief and practice. The presence of dragon cult materials in Farum Azula itself suggests that the integration between ancient and contemporary traditions was not merely one-sided adoption of ancient elements by contemporary practitioners, but genuine dialogue that influenced both parties to the relationship. The ancient dragons who survived the transition to the new order found their own traditions enriched and renewed through contact with younger forms of spiritual expression. The mystery of how these materials reached the floating city, whether through physical transportation by dedicated pilgrims or through more esoteric means related to the temporal distortions that characterize Farum Azula's existence, adds another layer of complexity to the already intricate relationship between ancient and contemporary forms of religious practice. The presence of these artifacts in the crumbling city suggests ongoing connections that transcend the simple passage of historical time. The banished knights who found their way to Farum Azula, marked by dragon imagery and motivated by seeking the stormy eye that represents the heart of temporal distortion, provide evidence that the integration between ancient dragons and contemporary institutions created new possibilities for individual spiritual development that had not existed in either tradition independently. These seekers found in the crumbling city opportunities for transformation that were unavailable in the earthbound realm. The teleportation mechanisms that bring certain individuals to Farum Azula at crucial moments in their spiritual development suggest that the ancient dragon's mastery over time and space continues to operate according to principles that recognize and respond to deep commitments and ultimate sacrifices. The floating city serves not merely as a monument to past greatness, but as an active force that continues to shape events in the contemporary world. The legacy of the war between the ancient dragons and Leyndell extends far beyond its immediate military and diplomatic consequences to encompass fundamental changes in how power, authority, and legitimacy are understood and exercised throughout the lands between. The successful integration of ancient and contemporary traditions created precedents for cooperation that would influence subsequent relationships between different forms of authority and belief. The transformation of potential enemies into valued allies through personal bonds of friendship and respect demonstrates possibilities for conflict resolution that transcend conventional approaches based solely on superior force or political calculation. The relationship between Godwin and Fortissax became a model for forms of diplomacy that recognized the importance of individual character and personal commitment in creating lasting solutions to complex problems. Among the most profound mysteries that emerge from the long history of Draconic civilization lies the capacity of these magnificent beings to experience emotions that transcend their physical nature and cosmic responsibilities, feelings that connect them not only to their divine purposes but to individual relationships that can transform the very foundations of their existence. The discovery that dragons are capable of genuine love represents one of the most significant revelations about their inner nature, challenging assumptions about creatures whose power and longevity might be expected to place them beyond the reach of such intimate and personal forms of connection. The transformation of Lanciax from her original draconic form into human appearance marks one of the most extraordinary examples of voluntary shape-changing in recorded history, representing not merely a display of supernatural ability, but a deliberate choice to bridge the vast gulf that separated her kind from the mortals with whom she sought to establish meaningful relationships. This metamorphosis required not only the technical mastery necessary to assume an entirely different physical form, but the psychological flexibility to adapt her consciousness to the limitations and perspectives that characterize human existence. The motivation that drove Lanciax to undertake such a radical transformation speaks to the depth of her desire to understand and communicate with the Dragon Knights who served in the ancient dragon cult of Lindell. Her assumption of human form was not a disguise adopted for purposes of deception or infiltration, but a genuine attempt to create conditions where authentic dialogue and mutual understanding could develop between beings whose fundamental natures were separated by evolutionary gulfs that seemed impossible to cross. The role that Lanciax assumed as a priestess within the dragon cult provided her with opportunities to observe human spiritual life from perspectives that would have been impossible to achieve while maintaining her original draconic form. Her intimate involvement in the religious practices and theological discussions that characterized the cult allowed her to develop appreciation for forms of faith and devotion that operated according to principles different from, but complementary to, the cosmic loyalty that had traditionally characterized draconic service. The relationships that Lanciax formed during her time in human form appear to have been genuine rather than merely instrumental, creating bonds that were based on mutual respect and shared commitment to spiritual principles rather than simple fascination with exotic beings or desire to exploit draconic power for personal advantage. The Dragon Knights who interacted with her during this period gained access to forms of wisdom and understanding that had previously been available only to the ancient dragons themselves. The development of romantic feelings between Lanciax and the Dragon Knights who served within her spiritual community represents one of the most remarkable examples of interspecies emotional connection in recorded history, demonstrating that the capacity for love can transcend even the most fundamental differences in nature, origin, and ultimate destiny. These relationships challenged conventional understanding of the boundaries that separate different forms of consciousness and opened new possibilities for connection that neither species had previously imagined. Vike, whose exceptional qualities as both warrior and spiritual seeker made him the most beloved among Lanciax's human companions, embodied the highest potential for synthesis between draconic and human virtues that the ancient dragon cult sought to achieve. His mastery of combat techniques that honored both traditions, combined with spiritual dedication that reflected genuine understanding of the principles underlying dragon worship, made him an ideal representative of the possibilities that such integration could achieve. The red lightning that Vike learned to channel through his spear represents one of the most significant examples of power transfer between ancient dragons and human practitioners, for this was not merely the teaching of technical skills, but the sharing of fundamental forces that had previously been exclusive to beings who possessed stone scales and temporal mastery. The ability of a mortal human to wield such power demonstrated that the barriers between different forms of existence were less absolute than had previously been assumed. The unique nature of Vike's red lightning, which differed from conventional electrical attacks through its integration with temporal and spiritual elements that reflected his training under Lanciax's guidance, marked him as a being who had achieved genuine synthesis between human limitation and draconic transcendence. His weapons became conduits for forces that operated according to principles that neither species could have accessed independently. The tragedy that eventually claimed Vike, drawing him away from his relationship with Lanciax and into the destructive embrace of the frenzied flame, illustrates the vulnerability that accompanies even the most successful attempts at transcending species, boundaries, and conventional limitations. His descent into madness and imprisonment represents not failure of the synthesis he had achieved, but the intervention of forces that recognized the threat such synthesis posed to existing structures of cosmic control. The love that Lanciax felt for Vike persisted even after his transformation and corruption, demonstrating that genuine draconic affection possesses qualities of permanence and unconditional acceptance that transcend the changes that time and circumstance can inflict upon its objects. Her continued devotion to his memory serves as testament to the depth of emotional connection that dragons are capable of experiencing when they allow themselves to become vulnerable to such feelings. The broader implications of Lanciax's capacity for love extend beyond her individual relationships to encompass questions about the fundamental nature of draconic consciousness and the role that emotional connections play in the spiritual development of beings whose existence spans cosmic ages. The discovery that ancient dragons could form such bonds suggests that their legendary loyalty to their divine masters may have been motivated not merely by duty or programming, but by genuine affection and personal commitment. The friendship between Godwin and Fortissax represents another dimension of draconic emotional capacity, demonstrating that the bonds formed between dragons and other beings can encompass forms of loyalty and dedication that persist even beyond death itself. The relationship that emerged from their initial combat created connections that would eventually transcend the boundaries between life and death, victory and defeat, service and sacrifice. Fortissax's response to Godwin's assassination on the Night of Black Knives reveals the extremes to which draconic loyalty can extend when it is rooted in genuine personal affection rather than mere political alliance or practical cooperation. The ancient dragon's decision to enter the realm of death itself to combat the corruption that was consuming his friend's remains represents one of the most heroic acts of devotion in recorded history. The transformation that Fortissax underwent in his battle against the death that was spreading through Godwin's body marked him as a being who was willing to sacrifice his own essential nature in service of friendship and loyalty. His gradual corruption by the very forces he sought to combat demonstrates the tragic dimension that can characterize even the most noble attempts to preserve what cannot be preserved or protect what cannot be protected. The lich dragon that Fortissax became through his prolonged exposure to the energies of death represents a form of existence that combines elements of both life and death in ways that transcend conventional understanding of either state. His persistence in this transformed condition speaks to the power of will and devotion to sustain consciousness, even when the normal foundations of existence have been fundamentally altered. The deathbed dream within which Fortissax continues his impossible battle against the corruption of his friend provides insight into the nature of draconic consciousness and its relationship to concepts of time, death, and spiritual persistence. This internal realm, where the ancient dragon wages eternal war against forces that cannot be ultimately defeated, represents both the nobility and the futility that can characterize love when it encounters limitations that even draconic power cannot overcome. The irony that Fortissax's battle against death ultimately serves to perpetuate the very condition he seeks to cure illustrates the complex relationship between intention and outcome that characterizes many of the most well-intentioned acts of sacrifice and service. His efforts to preserve Godwin's essential nature may actually contribute to maintaining the corruption that has claimed his friend, creating a cycle of well-intentioned harm that cannot be easily resolved. The broader pattern of draconic loyalty that emerges from examination of relationships like those between Lanciax and Vike, Fortissax and Godwin, and the ancient dragons and their departed god reveals consistent themes of devotion that persists beyond reasonable limits and love that endures despite overwhelming evidence of its futility. These relationships suggest that dragons are capable of emotional commitments that transcend practical considerations and rational analysis. The capacity for such intense and enduring loyalty represents both the greatest strength and the most significant vulnerability of draconic nature for beings who can love so deeply. inevitably make themselves subject to forms of suffering that more emotionally detached creatures might avoid. The dragons who form such bonds discover that their immortal nature, rather than protecting them from loss, simply extends the duration of their grief and the scope of their commitment to hopeless causes. The environmental dragon Exyx, whose hatred of dragon communion practices has sustained him through corruption by scarlet rot and motivated his continued vigilance over a communion altar, demonstrates another aspect of draconic emotional intensity, showing how negative emotions can be as powerful and persistent as positive ones in shaping draconic behavior and maintaining purpose, even under extreme adversity. The corruption that has claimed Exyx parallels the transformations that affected Fortissax and other dragons who committed themselves to impossible battles against forces that transcend individual power to overcome. His persistence in his chosen role, despite the obvious toll that his condition exacts upon him, reveals the same willingness to sacrifice personal well-being for abstract principles that characterizes the most devoted examples of draconic loyalty. The emotional connections that dragons form with other beings appear to operate according to principles that prioritize depth and permanence over breadth and flexibility, creating relationships that can endure across cosmic ages, but which also make adaptation to changing circumstances particularly difficult. The dragons who love most deeply often find themselves trapped by the very intensity of their feelings into courses of action that may be objectively harmful or futile. The transformation of these emotional bonds across different historical periods and cosmic orders reveals the ways in which draconic nature adapts to new circumstances while maintaining essential characteristics that transcend particular relationships or historical contexts. The loyalty that ancient dragons showed to their departed god finds new expression in the devotion that later dragons show to human companions, suggesting continuity of emotional capacity rather than fundamental change in draconic nature. The tragic dimension that characterizes so many draconic relationships may be inherent to the combination of immortal perspective and mortal emotions that defines their essential nature. Beings who can love across geological timescales inevitably encounter forms of loss and separation that would be impossible for creatures with shorter lifespans and less intense emotional capacities to experience. The lessons that emerge from examination of draconic emotional life suggest that the capacity for deep and lasting love represents both an evolutionary advantage and a profound source of vulnerability, creating possibilities for cooperation and mutual support that transcend species boundaries, while also exposing those who possess such capacity to forms of suffering that may persist far beyond the circumstances that originally caused them. The synthesis of power and vulnerability that characterizes draconic emotional experience provides insight into the relationship between strength and sensitivity that defines the most complex forms of consciousness. The dragons who possess the greatest physical and supernatural capabilities often demonstrate the most profound capacity for emotional connection, suggesting that true power may require rather than preclude the ability to form meaningful relationships with others. The examples of draconic love and loyalty that persist throughout the long history of their civilization serve as reminders that even the most cosmic perspectives and transcendent capabilities cannot eliminate the fundamental importance of personal connections and individual relationships in creating meaning and purpose. The dragons who achieve the greatest significance are often those who allow their vast powers to be guided and directed by intimate bonds that connect them to specific individuals and particular causes. The ultimate lesson of draconic emotional experience lies in its demonstration that love and loyalty While they cannot overcome all obstacles or prevent all forms of loss and separation, possess the power to create meaning and purpose that transcend the particular circumstances within which they operate. The dragons who love deeply achieve forms of significance that persist long after the objects of their affection have been lost to time and change. The persistence of these emotional bonds across transformations of form, changes of circumstance, and even the transition from life to death suggests that the connections formed between conscious beings may represent one of the most fundamental and enduring aspects of existence, capable of maintaining their essential character even when everything else has been altered beyond recognition. And so our journey through the realm of dragons draws to its gentle close, like the final notes of an ancient song that echoes long after the last voice has fallen silent. We have soared with stone-scaled ancients through the twilight of prehistory, witnessed the patient devotion of beast servants who transformed instinct into worship, and walked beside the mortal children of Greyoll as they learned to find new forms of power in a world that no longer offered them the gift of eternity. From the crumbling spires of Farum Azula to the communion altars where desperate mortals sought transformation through consumption, we have traced the long arc of Draconic civilization as it adapted to cosmic changes beyond its control. We have seen how love could bridge the gulf between species, how loyalty could persist beyond death itself, and how even the mightiest beings must eventually face the truth that all things pass away in their appointed time. The dragons teach us that immortality is not freedom from change but the burden of witnessing endless transformation, that power without wisdom leads only to corruption, and that the deepest connections between souls transcend the particular forms those souls may inhabit. Rest now in the knowledge that somewhere beyond the storm-racked heights of eternity, the ancient songs continue their eternal chorus, calling all weary hearts toward the peace that waits beyond the boundaries of time itself. Close your eyes, dear traveler, and let the gentle darkness carry your dreams on wings of stone and starlight.